thank you everyone for coming to my session this morning. My name is Matt Honeycutt, and you are sitting in the session on building your own application framework with ASP.NET MVC3. So if you're in the wrong session, go. So just a quick little bit of background. I've been doing ASP.NET MVC development since the first release candidate of MVC1. So I've been doing this for quite a while now. I didn't realize how many years it had been until I kind of looked back at it. So I've been building MVC apps for a long time, and over those years I've realized that there's certain things that I don't want to have to worry about when I'm doing MVC applications. You know, there's things that I want to just assume are going to be handled. And that's really what this session is about. It's about establishing conventions and pushing common behavior and things like that into a layer of the application where you don't have to think about it for day-to-day development. You can just kind of assume it's going to be handled for you. At the same time, when we're doing something like that, we also have to be sure that we provide a way to back out of those conventions. You know, we don't want our framework to force us down a road. We want to be able to step out and do something different if we need to. So that's really what the whole point of this session is really looking at how we build a, convention-oriented framework to simplify, day-to-day development with MVC. So before we get to the real meat of the content, you guys are probably really sick of seeing these slides, but got to thank the sponsors, RecruitWise. If you want to send feedback on the session, we're in 413A. So feel free to do that. So thanks to RecruitWise and RocksPress, they make CodeStock possible. So really cool that we have this here in East Tennessee. So thanks to them. All right, so that's out of the way. So like I said, today what we're going to look at is really how can we make it easier to do to build applications in ASP.NET MVC, and specifically how can we make it easier on your application. So the conventions that work for one application aren't necessarily going to be the right conventions for a different application. That's why I'm not a big fan of some of these kind of general, all-encompassing, application frameworks that are out there. I think you really have to tailor it to, your business requirements and, the type of application that you're building. And really, how you want to write code. That's really what the framework's supposed to enable is, you to write code the way you want to write code without having to worry about some of these kind of cross-cutting concerns and getting bogged down in the details. So if you go and create a new ASP.NET MVC3 project today with Visual Studio, there's a lot in the box. You don't have to use all of it. There's a lot of different ways you can solve the same problem with ASP.NET MVC. This is just a few of the pieces. So there's a model binder in ASP.NET. How many people here are doing ASP.NET MVC today? Wow, almost everybody. Awesome. So you guys are at least familiar with the basic concepts, which is good because I'm not going to really talk a lot about what the MVC pattern is and stuff like that. I'm really going to talk about a higher level than that. So, in the box in MVC3, we have model binding support. It's gotten a lot better since MVC1. Now we can bind, JSON requests, post, get, all that stuff. IOC, version of control, that whole paradigm is much better supported in MVC3 than it has been previously. Before, you could do it, but there weren't, you could hook it up especially for, creating your controllers. In MVC3, it's kind of wired in everywhere. You can kind of plug in structure map or an inject or whatever you want to use, and MVC3 will take advantage of it everywhere. MVC doesn't come with view models in the box, but it is based around its model view controller. It's kind of assuming that you're going to build view models, and it has some pretty good support for working with view models. Security, so MVC is it's built on ASP.NET, so it still supports the standard forms authentication stuff, the Windows authentication stuff that ASP.NET does, so that's in the box. Validation, so there is validation support in the box with MVC3. It's much improved over MVC2. It's built on jQuery validation now out of the box. But there's lots of different ways you can hook into that, as we'll see. jQuery is in the box. If you make a new MVC3 project, the jQuery libraries are right there. Microsoft has kind of thrown their weight behind jQuery now, which is good. Instead of them building a competing framework, they're taking advantage of what the open source community has. So jQuery is in the box, and that's a pretty big shift from if you've done WebForms. WebForms, it's really hard to use jQuery or anything like that. If you're doing MVC, you're probably going to be using jQuery, so you need to be comfortable with JavaScript. MVC, starting with MVC 2, has a good support for UI templates. So you can take advantage of this templating framework in MVC and build conventions for how your forms should look, how things should be displayed. It's a really flexible framework, and we're going to look at how we can take advantage of that. Not necessarily in the box, but things that are really easy to get to, especially now that we have NuGet. There's just a whole host of open source frameworks, open source libraries, and things that you can pull in to make it easier to build MVC applications. And you've got to kind of decide which ones you want to use, and it kind of depends on how you want to write code. But there's a ton of stuff, and NuGet makes it really easy to pull those things in and leverage them now. So we're given a lot of these pieces, these just kind of blocks with MVC, which is a pretty big shift from WebForms. WebForms, I kind of look at that as like this big black box that's got a few knobs on it that you can kind of adjust a few things here and there. But if you want to do something that's not, something that's an extension point that Microsoft thought about, if they didn't think about, hey, you want to use a grid view in this particular way, you're kind of screwed. It's pretty much you go back and you write your own grid view control. MVC is very different from that. MVC puts you a lot closer to the HTML. So if you can think it up, you can do it with MVC. The problem is because you can think it up and you can do it with MVC, you can do it a lot of different ways, and you can kind of get bogged down in the details and start looking at instead of what you want your application to do, you have to start thinking about how you want it to do it. And that's okay, you want to think about those things sometimes, but for cross-cutting things like how a form is laid out, how validation is handled, you don't want to think about that every single time you have to touch something in your application. It'd be great if your application framework took care of some of that for you. So MVC, as opposed to being this big monolithic black box that's not very flexible, I kind of view it as a bunch of different pieces that you can kind of arrange into whatever shape you want. Unfortunately, if you do not do MVC correctly, you can end up with something that looks like this. And unfortunately, I've built applications where this is what we ended up with. Yeah, so don't do that. You've got to decide early on, what you want your application to look like. How do you want the code in your application to look? What conventions do you want to follow? What pieces of the MVC framework that are in the box do you want to take advantage of? What open source frameworks do you want to pull in and take advantage of? So you got to make those decisions up front so that you don't end up with this giant mess of pieces just all kind of cobbled together. So one of the themes that I'm going to be kind of going back to throughout this is trying to reduce what you have to think about during day-to-day development. So right now, if you just took what was in the box, you just new project, ASP.NET MVC3 web application, and you went to make a new form or whatever, there's a lot of different concerns you have to think about. All right, so we have to think about error handling. What's going to happen if something goes wrong? What's going to happen if something goes wrong in my controller? What's going to happen if I make an AJAX request from my view and something goes wrong? You have to think about all those things and handle those. You have to think about how you want your page laid out. You have to think about, okay, do I want if I'm building a form, do I want my labels on the left, my form inputs on the right, or do I want a more top-down form where the labels are above the input elements? You got to think about those things. JavaScript. So you got to think about, where's my JavaScript going to live first? Am I just going to put it straight in the view, or am I going to follow more HTML best practices and put my JavaScript in external files and link those in? You got to think about those things. You have to think about validation. So do you want to have your validation messages displayed right by each of your fields on your form? Or do you want validation messages, validation errors to go above your form in a summary? MVC will let you do either one of those, so you have to decide which one you want. CSS. If you're using WebForms, you don't have to think as much about CSS. In fact, it's a little hard. It's getting better, but older versions of ASP.NET, if you really didn't have a lot of control over the styling of things, it was really hard to come up with CSS rules that would match specific elements just because you have no idea what the ID is going to be at runtime, not from a CSS file especially. So in MVC, we don't have that problem. We're in complete control over our HTML. So we have much more fine-grained control over CSS, so we're going to take advantage of that. But where's that CSS going to live? Are we going to put CSS directly in the elements? Are we going to put a style section in each of our views that has the style for that view? Are we going to put our CSS in an external file? We have lots of choices there, and we have to decide where those things are going to live in our application. Security. So in the box, we have the Forms authentication provider. We have the Windows authentication provider. But depending on the application that we're building, we have to think about which of our controllers, which of our actions are public, which ones do we want to let anybody access, and which ones do we want to protect. Which ones do we want to require a user to log in before they can get to. So that's not something that MVC obviously can't make that assumption for you. It doesn't know if you're building a public-facing or a public-oriented site that is, maybe has an admin area, but most of the controllers are meant to be public. Or if you've got a application where the only thing you want public is the login form. You've got to establish some kind of convention to enforce that. We also have to think about data access. An application that does not have some sort of data store is probably not all that interesting. So you got to think about data access and how you're going to handle that. Are your controllers going to talk directly to your database? Are you going to use the dependency injection stuff to inject the repository? Are your controllers, if you're using in Hibernate, are they just going to talk directly to the session? You have to make those kinds of decisions, and you want to be consistent in your application, because if you're not, think about what a new developer is going to do if he comes onto your team and has to start working in their application. He's going to see 10 different examples of data access, and he's got to figure out which one he should use. So you want to establish some conventions so you don't have to do that. So what's the problem in all of this thinking? There's no thought at all given to the feature we're actually trying to implement. We're thinking in really fine-grained details about how we want to implement that feature, but we're not really thinking a lot about the business requirements and the feature itself. What are we actually trying to do? It's much better, in my opinion, if you can focus on what you want your application to do and less about how you want it to do it for your day-to-day development activities. So what we're really trying to do when I talk about building an application framework, we're trying to go from this, just these loose pieces that aren't really tied together that we can kind of pick and choose and mix and match however we want. We want to go from this to this nice cohesive unit that's going to handle a lot of those common cross-cutting concerns for us so that we don't have to. We want to pull all these pieces, or at least the pieces that we want to take advantage of, together, tie them together, and then not have to think about it most of the time in our day-to-day development. So if we do that, our day-to-day thinking, all that background noise about how do we get access to our database, how is validation going to work, how am I going to lay out my forms, where's my JavaScript going to live, all those decisions have been made, and hopefully I can take advantage of those transparently without having to do anything special. Hopefully all that stuff fades to the background, and instead of thinking about those cross-cutting concerns, I can think about the business rules I need to implement. I can think about the requirements coming from my product owner and figure out what I actually need to do. All right. So I think there's a few things that, a few qualities that you can look for, and you can say if it does this, it's a good application framework. In my opinion, and this is all my opinion, built from several years of doing MVC, but I think a good application framework should free developers from uninteresting concerns. And by uninteresting concerns, I mean things like, where do my labels go on the form? Where are my validation messages going to be? I think a good application framework uses conventions. So, conventions for this is how things should be laid out, this is how validation works, this is how you get access to the database. But at the same time, it shouldn't be so rigid that you can't deviate from those conventions, because no set of conventions is going to work 100% of the time. So you want to have conventions that degrade gracefully, that you can override progressively. So we'll look at that, especially when we get to the templating stuff, how we can build something that 90% of the time we don't have to even think about it. But if we want to customize how something works, we can start backing out of that convention a little bit at a time. So it's not an all or nothing thing. We can take advantage of most of the convention and not all of it if we want to. A good application framework is built just in time. So what do I mean? So one of the principles of Agile is, we don't do this big design phase up front. We don't build this, monolithic requirements document or anything like that. I think the same thing is true for an application framework. We don't want to spend 6 months building out all these conventions and all this infrastructure and then find out that we really only needed like 10% of that. So if you're going to build an application framework, and if you're doing MVC, I think you should invest in that. You want to do it, just in time. Only build the conventions once you know what the conventions should be and you're ready to take advantage of them. So there's no point in building in infrastructure if we're never going to take advantage of it. And if we do that, we don't necessarily know what that infrastructure should even look like. We may build in some conventions, and then later on when we get to where we actually want to take advantage of them, we may decide that's the wrong convention. We really didn't want to go down this road. So don't spend a bunch of time up front building this framework. It should be something that kind of grows and evolves as your application grows and evolves. A good application framework should help developers work the way they want to work. So that means if your developers want to take advantage of inversion control, you should build that into your framework. If for whatever reason they're not comfortable with that, don't make them. Don't make them do that. The reason is if your developers are having to fight the framework constantly, they're going to be a lot less productive, and that's the opposite of what we want out of our application framework. We want something that's going to make our developers and make us as productive as we can possibly be. We don't want something that we're going to keep running into like a brick wall repeatedly. That's the opposite of what we want here. The last thing is, so an application framework, a lot of it's conventions and establishing those conventions and building in default behavior and pushing things down into the framework. When we do that, we want it to be things that make sense. So what's something that wouldn't make sense? So let's say we built in some JavaScript error handling, just some global error handling. That way if an AJAX request or something like that bombs, we don't have to think about it day to day. Our framework takes care of it. How much sense would it make if our conventional error handling was to do something like just close the user's browser? If you were a new developer working on that product and you just thought, oh, okay, I don't have to worry about error handling. I'll just make this AJAX request, and if it goes wrong, I'll let the framework take care of it. And the first time that happened, the browser just closed, you're going to be left scratching your head. That's not a convention that makes sense. So you have to think about this and think about what kinds of things are actually going to make sense, and push those things into your application framework. Don't push things down that are going to confuse and baffle people. So think about it a little bit from a new developer perspective. If somebody new came into your code base, are they going to understand the conventions? Are they going to make sense? And if not, you might want to reevaluate it. Maybe that's not a good convention to bake in. So any questions so far? I do have a ton of code, so it's not all just slides, just the beginning is slides. So. All right, yeah, and on that note, let's look at some code. So the demos I'm going to show you today, I built an open source application called Fail Tracker. And I was trying to kill two birds with one stone when I built this. One was to have an application and some code that I could use for this talk and that I could point people at so that you could go check out the end result. The other reason I built Fail Tracker was, how many people are using Pivotal Tracker? How many people know what Pivotal Tracker is? Fewer than I thought. Wow. Okay. If you haven't used Pivotal Tracker, it was a really cool tool for doing agile story tracking and things like that. It was free. Unfortunately, they're about to start charging for it. And as much as I like Pivotal Tracker, there's a lot of things about it I don't like. I'm not going to pay money for it. So since Pivotal Tracker, which is what I've been using for keeping a lot of my projects, organizing the stories and things like that, since that's going commercial, I decided, well, I've got some pretty strong opinions about how a bug tracking and issue story management type application should work. I'm just going to sit down and actually build one. So that's what Fail Tracker is. So it's a real application. My plan is to eventually stand it up on Windows Azure because I've got a bunch of credit hours there I need to burn anyway. So to stand it up there, let people come in and kind of use it the way they were using Pivotal Tracker. For today, though, really we're just looking at it for its application framework. So I'm going to show you some of the conventions and things I've built into there that make it easy for me to focus on what I want it to do instead of how I want a feature to work. So let's see. Get out of the way here. So there's not really a whole lot to Fail Tracker. We have a domain model. Right now it's pretty primitive. There's, an issue. Basically the two key actors in it are an issue, which could be a story or a bug or whatever, and then a user. That's really about it. We have our usual unit test project and then our actual MVC3 application. So what I'm going to show you is the end result. So this is everything built on top of the application framework for Fail Tracker. So after I show you, how it should work, what we're going to do is, through the magic of Git, I'm going to destroy the application framework. So I'm going to strip everything back to, this is how it would look if I didn't have that. So this is how things would look and how we'd have to work if we didn't have conventions for things like UI layout and validation and all those things. So this is fail tracker. It's pretty simple. So I've got some dummy data loaded in here for displaying a list of issues. Got a little bit of Ajax-y stuff so you can click a button and preview issues. We've got forms for adding. There's validation built into it. So same thing on editing, validation built into it. And there's a lot going on under the hood that we'll look at a little bit later as we get to it. So yeah, we've got some nice things for nice confirmation dialogues and things that are all baked into the framework. So it was very easy for me to make this pop up here. I really just called one function and let the application framework take care of the rest of it. I didn't have to do anything low level with jQuery. So yeah, it's a pretty simple application. And what we're going to do is git checkout code stock. Yeah. Oops, I'm in the wrong directory. All right, so one command, I have now destroyed my application framework. So we'll come back here and we'll reload everything. So go back to the slides for a minute. I know you guys love slides as much as I do. All right, so before we actually get to the application framework, there's a couple of things I want to talk about that if you're doing MVC development, I really think you should be taking advantage of them. I've done more MVC applications now than I can count. I've truly lost count. But there's two libraries that I've used on every single MVC app going back to MVC 1. There's a third one that I've used on probably all but 2 projects, but there's 2 that I've used everywhere. And those are the MVC Futures library and the MVC Contrib library. Anybody know what MVC Futures is? Anybody using it? Got one hand? Okay, so going back to MVC 1, Microsoft has also shipped the MVC Futures library along with whatever version of MVC has been shipped. The Futures library is where they dump kind of experimental things that didn't quite make the cut for whatever version. So the MVC 3 Futures library has some things that just weren't quite ready, or they weren't really quite sure they wanted to do this in part of the core MVC framework. And a lot of that stuff will show up in the next framework baked into it, or it'll show up in the next version of the .NET framework. Looking back at the version 1 and version 2 of Futures, some of that stuff didn't go to MVC 3, it actually went to .NET 4. So there's some stuff in there that really if you're doing MVC development, it helps a ton. So in MVC 3, the Futures library has some additional data annotation attributes, so for some additional validation types and things like that. It also has some additional HTML helpers and things that you can take advantage of. The caveat is that Microsoft will tell you is the Futures library is not quite as polished as the core MVC framework, hasn't received quite the same level of testing and things like that. In practice, I've never had an issue with it. I've used the MVC Futures going back to MVC 1 and never had an issue with anything in there. So the official word is that it's not quite all that polished. In practice, I've been fine using it. So the other library that I've used is MVC Contrib. How many people are using MVC Contrib? One hand. Are you serious? Okay, so 3 people are using MVC Contrib. Has anybody heard of it? Yeah? Okay. Any reason people aren't using it? I'm just curious. Open source, not in the box, so that's why people aren't using it?
Usually when I want to use it, like to use it some other documentation.
Yep.
And I was in the crunch, so I wanted to get something done.
Yep, common complaint and absolutely valid. Yeah, so the comment was, I'm not using MVC Contrib because the documentation is not all that great. That is a problem. Yeah, if you're going to use MVC Contrib, it's gotten better. The documentation on Codeplex has improved, but there's still going to be times where somebody's going to point you at a blog post to figure out how to take advantage of something that's in there, and that's unfortunate because there's
What's your feeling toward third-party stuff like Telerik and Pepper?
Honestly, I used like the Telerik stuff when I was doing WebForms. I have not needed it since I started doing MVC. I do use the crap out of jQuery UI, but yeah, beyond that, I know people are shipping, these controls that, wrap jQuery UI and things like that for MVC. It's additional HTML helpers. I got to tell you, I don't think that's the right approach. I think if you're trying not to learn JavaScript and you're doing MVC, you should probably go back to WebForms. You need to know JavaScript if you're going to do MVC. You really do. You don't want to try to abstract that away. JavaScript is very, very different from C#. You can't abstract everything that you can do with JavaScript in C#. You shouldn't try. So yeah, your mileage may vary. Mine is that you really don't need those things. So yeah, those two libraries, MVC Futures and MVC Contrib, I've used those on pretty much every project. MVC Futures, lots of new data annotation attributes, some additional helpers. MVC Contrib also has lots of additional HTML helpers in there. More and more, some of that stuff is starting to show up in the core .NET framework, or at least an alternate implementation of it. So MVC Contrib is not as important in MVC 3 as it was maybe in MVC 1 or MVC 2. But it's still important. There's still things you can take advantage of. It's got some nice libraries to help you unit test your controllers. Just lots of different things in there that you can take advantage of. So that is it for the intro stuff. Now I'm going to start making very strong statements. The problem with software development, I think, is that every single question, no matter what, the correct answer to it is it depends, right? So there's no single bit of advice I can give you that will be universally applicable to every single application. So everything I'm going to tell you from this point forward are my opinions and things I've found to be true from the applications I've worked on. Depending on your application and how you like to write code, some of these may not make sense to you. You may disagree with them, and that's fine. So you don't necessarily have to do these things. I do think you should have an opinionated framework, though, and that's really what this is all about. So from this point forward, I'm making some strong statements about what you should do in your application. Take it with a grain of salt. So the first one is take advantage of strong typing wherever possible. So what do I mean by strong typing? I mean take advantage of compile time safety everywhere that you can. There's a lot of different helpers that are built into MVC out of the box. Not all of them are typed or strongly typed. So if we go over to fail tracker, and remember I've destroyed, let me make sure. Yeah, good. So I've actually destroyed the application framework that I had built in there. I've introduced some things that are not the way I would do them so that we can intentionally go in and clean those up. So I'm going to jump over to the master layout here. And I am using Razor. If you're doing MVC 3, or if you upgrade an MVC 2 app to MVC 3, definitely take advantage of Razor. Like, I was not that excited about Razor when I saw the first blog posts about it. After I used Razor the first time, I was like, oh wow, I get it now. This is awesome. So even if this is one of the things where I think we're actually better off than some of the like Rails and things like that. Razor is an excellent view engine. It gets out of the way. It's amazing when you actually sit down and use it. So all the samples here are Razor. So let's fire the application back up. So at the very top of the application, I just have this, fail tracker logo, and I want for anywhere that users are in the application for them to be able to click on that and have it take them to the home page. So I do that using the action link helper. And the action link helper, the one that's, that I'm taking advantage of here, is all based on strings. So the bad thing about strings is that it's not compile time safe, right? So I've got HTML action link. I want to label a fail tracker. I want it to call the dashboard action on my issues controller. And right now, this works fine. It's building up a link. It knows it can look at the routing information and figure out, this is the URL for the dashboard. This is how you get there. So that works fine. What if, though, I fat-fingered something? So, I had maybe a small typo in here. This code still compiles fine. The code compiles, excellent. And no error at runtime. Where I'm going to run into an error is the first time the user clicks on that link, because that link's going to blow up. The typo I had was translated directly into a route, into a URL, and MVC spit that out happily. So I have no compile time safety there. So what I can do instead is I can use a strongly typed version of action link. Oops. Oh yeah, that's one little thing that I still trip up on sometimes. If you're going to take advantage of this other overload of action link, you do have to wrap the entire expression in parentheses, just because, you know, Razor's going to see the you know, the type parameter here. It's going to see the angle bracket and think, oh, it's an HTML tag, and it's going to, you know, try to treat that as HTML instead of C#, which is not what we want. So there's a strongly typed version that takes in a lambda expression off of our controller.
Is that in the core framework, or is that one of the futures?
This is still in futures. There's a little bit of a performance hit for using these versus using the ones built on strings, because it does have to do a little bit of reflection. If you look at the code, it's actually gotten a lot better over time. They've actually introduced a lot of caching and things like that, so that they're actually caching this expression, so there's very little performance hit for using these anymore. And in practice, I've never actually hit a situation where my bottleneck was rendering a link. You know, you might, if you're, you know, if you have an application that's just getting hammered over and over, and you're not doing any kind of caching or anything like that, you know, that could be a problem. But odds are, if you have an application that's, you know, like Twitter, where you're just getting hammered constantly, you're going to be doing caching and things like that anyway. So it's not going to be, you know, regenerating the entire view. It's going to be pulling some of that from cache, right? So in practice, I wouldn't worry at all about the, you know, the performance hit that you're going to get from using the strongly typed version.
So the compiler checking comes in if you want to do some fact breaking inside your lambda.
Yep, exactly. Yep, so I'm going to take out this one, and actually I forgot to show this, but there's a flag. Let me make sure I've got this enabled. There's a flag you can set in your projects, and I bounce back and forth on whether or not I would tell people to enable this, but if you actually go and look at your project file for the MVC application, there is this MVC build views option. If you set this to true and you build your project, it's actually going to go through and compile all your views as well. So if you have a typo in your view and you're using the strongly typed versions of things, you're going to get a compile time error right there. That's really nice. The problem is that it adds quite a bit of overhead to the compile step. So if you're doing test-driven development, which I'm a big fan of, that extra, 5-10 seconds that it takes to build up your web app before you can actually run your tests gets really annoying. So I'm going to turn it on. Actually, I'm just going to leave it off because it gets really annoying. Even for demos, it gets annoying. Yep. The nice thing though is that you can specify this on the command line. So if you have a build server, which you should. If you have a build server, you can just tell your build server to pass in, property MVC build views equals true. Now, when your build server compiles your application to run all your tests, it's going to go ahead and build your views. So you're not going to find out quite as early if you have something wrong with your view, but your build server will still catch it, which is a lot better than finding out in production, right? So I'm going to leave that off. If your mileage may vary, you may be okay leaving it on. It is nice to get that feedback earlier. But at the same time, that extra time that it takes for it to compile everything is just a little too painful for me. All right, so yeah, right now we're taking advantage of the strongly typed action link overload. And so I did fat finger something. Yes, I did. So see, perfect. So it's not issue controller, it's actually issues controller. So I actually get a compile time error now. If I was using the other string-based version, I would have gotten no error until I actually tried to click on that link. So let me fix that. Yes, that looks much better. And it works, generates the correct link and all that good stuff. And I can go ahead and take advantage of this in my menu as well. I can swap in instead of HTML action link with strings, we'll take advantage of the lambda-based version, the strongly typed version.
It looked like a compile time error, sort of view between view and the web page.
You're right. That's when the ASP.NET compiler is firing off. It's compiling your views in. Like I was saying, you can set that build views flag to true. Then you'll actually get the error in Visual Studio because that's going to force Visual Studio to compile it there. Yeah, that's the trade-off, right? So if you turn that on, you'll find out immediately if you've got a controller name wrong or you've typoed something. but it does slow down your development.
Is there any way to just kind of force Visual Studio to go through and compile your views in your project, like that you might just do periodically without hacking your XML file?
Yeah, actually I've done that before. I put like a command script, a .cmd file or something in my solution directory that you can just come in and double click and it runs ms build and passes in that property MVC build views equals true, and that'll fire it off and get it to build your views. That way, if you want to do it periodically, you can do that. You could also, if you want to, you could set up a different build configuration. So you could put like a debug config that debug with view or build view, something like that. And you can actually specify that property in your project file as part of that that build configuration. So that way you could actually turn it on in Visual Studio. So I've done both of those. Yeah, for day-to-day stuff, I just don't like leaving it on because it's I do test-driven development, and that's like an extra 5 or 10 seconds before I can run my tests, and it gets really annoying.
And why IntelliSense does not pop up in the view even with lambdas and the strongly typed, the type action link call?
Yep. So that's because I am using ReSharper, and I'm using ReSharper 5.5, which does not support Razor. I've had mixed results. I know there's some things you can do to tell ReSharper to not try to provide IntelliSense in your views, to use the Visual Studio one, and I've had sometimes that works for me, sometimes it does not. When ReSharper 6 comes out, it's supposed to have full support for for Razor. It's actually supposed to have lots of good stuff for JavaScript too. I tried the betas. I've been trying the early access program releases and stuff, and they're too glitchy for me for right now. But yeah, if you're just using the Visual Studio IntelliSense, you'll get IntelliSense here. If you're using a newer version of ReSharper, you'll get IntelliSense. Dashboard. I'm just trying to make sure I've got this action link right, so I'm assigning a class of active. And this can all go away. All right, we can do the same thing for these others. So the log off action is part of my account controller. Whoops, and it did the same thing again. Got to remember to put that opening parenthesis. Excuse me?
You missed the end right.
Oh, yes, I did. Thank you. Yeah, and you see, Visual Studio actually does know, hey, this is an account controller, and hey, this log off is an action result. So, Visual Studio knows what these things are. It just, for whatever reason, like half the time when I fire this up with ReSharper enabled, it will not do the IntelliSense. Sometimes it works great, though. It's really frustrating. I wish ReSharper would hurry up with the version 6. Account controller. Oops, that's the issue controller. Issues, right? Not issue.
Hey, while you're typing, is the future stuff available with the Unit package?
Yes, it is. Yep. All right, let's see. If I did not typo any of that, our view should still render. Cool.
You have to have like a little inspector kind of code you could run against your views and come back and report to you. I found all these places where you're kind of using some old style, action link calls. Switch over here. That way you can do your own search for it. But,
yeah, so the comment was, it'd be great if there was some kind of tool that would help find where you are using the string-based versions of Action Link and stuff like that, and suggest, hey, why don't you come back in and use the strongly typed Lambda-based versions. I would be surprised if ReSharper doesn't have something like that when 6.0 comes out. And if it doesn't, I would say, the inspections in ReSharper are pluggable. You can plug it in, so I imagine that'd be, something good for somebody to write. Yeah, question?
That's actually what I was going to say.
Okay.
Some similar things where the styles for ReSharper.
Yep. Yeah. How many people are using ReSharper? Curious. Yeah, it's about half. Okay. Yeah. I don't get any money from JetBrains, but if you're doing stuff with Visual Studio, you really should be using ReSharper. It's a great tool. I don't know that I would want to use Visual Studio without ReSharper. So it is a little pricey, about $300 I think for a full license, but if you can get your work to pay for it. Excuse me?
You go to your Visual Studio user group, they get tons of licenses.
Do they?
They get given away, and you just show up and get one sooner or later.
Yeah, I actually meant to email them to see if I could get something to give away here today, but just didn't ever get around to it. So, all right. So there's another place where we can actually take advantage of strong typing. So let's look at the logon form. Whoops. Actually, what I want is log on. So there's lots, and we'll get into this more when we get to the UI conventions, there's lots of different HTML helpers for spitting out HTML snippets. The ones that I'm using right now in my view, and can everybody read that okay? Sounds good? Okay. Yeah, so the versions I'm using right now are based on strings. So those strings should match up to properties on my model, in this case the logon form. If they don't, the code's actually still valid, it's still going to run. So let's log out and look at this. So, here's my logon form and my actual view model. Now, my view model just has two properties, email address and password. I'm just generating this. This form should map to that view model, but it's really easy, if I'm using strings again, to typo something. And unfortunately, if I do this, this isn't even a compiler runtime error. It's still perfectly valid. Make sure I did that right. So yeah, if we look at our element, so I don't know, let's see if I can make that larger. Not really. Well, I don't know, you probably can't see it, but the form input element name is actually email address 1 because that's what I typed. So yeah, this will run fine until we try to post that form back. When the model binder runs, it's going to see from the form, because the email address 1, that's not going to match a property on my view model, on my form object, so it's not going to bind that. So my controller action method isn't going to get an email address at all. It's just going to get a blank.
So it's a silent failure, not a...
Yeah, this is the logic error at its best. Or not even really a logic error so much. This is a typo. But yeah, you will not find out about this until somebody goes to actually run it in the browser and stuff breaks. There's no, unless you're taking advantage of, a framework that allows you to write automated testing through a browser, you're not going to find something like this with your unit tests because your unit tests don't operate at this level. Fortunately, I do not have to use the string-based versions of HTML helpers to generate my form. So once again, and this is in the core MVC framework. This isn't part of the futures. There's label for, text box for, password for. All these HTML helpers that end in the word for expect some kind of lambda expression based on your model. So I just say, this is a label for my email address. And I want a text box for the model's email address. All right? And if I had MVC build views turned on and I had a typo like that, I'm going to find out about it in Visual Studio. Since I don't, I go to actually load this up, I'm going to get a compilation error. And again, you should have that MVC build views flag turned on at least on your build server, so you'll find out about this long before it gets to production. You'll find out long before that you've got a typo here. If we don't have a typo though, it renders our form and it renders the correct attribute for the label and the text box so that it will rebind to our model, our logon form, when it's posted back. And we can do the same thing for the password. So label for our model's password. And we want to show a password for that same property. And everything still works. It model binds correctly. It's validated. At the very least, at runtime, I'll get a compile error there. Hopefully my build server or Visual Studio will catch it for me. If you're using ReSharper, even with version 6 in its current buggy state, you will actually get an error on that line. ReSharper will see, this code does not compile. You'll get, the little red squigglies under there. So, once ReSharper 6 comes out, you'll have a much better visual indication that you've got a typo in something like that.
The issue's maybe not so important for the label control, right? Since it's not involved in the
Right. Yeah. The nice thing though is that if you generate your label using the Fluent Lambda-based version, it's actually going to be tied to the right input element. That way, if they click on it, it's going to put the caret in that text box. So it's it's not going to be a bug. It's not going to cause any real headaches or anything if you do mess it up. But it's nice to have that linked up. Yep. All right. So any questions on that? Let's try that again. All right, so our first convention is we're going to take advantage of strong typing wherever we possibly can. We're not going to use string-based versions of things in Fail Tracker. We're going to use the Lambda-based versions of things to make sure we have, at least compile time checking on our build server. All right, so this kind of gets us into a big area that we'll spend the next little bit on. Establish conventions for your UI. If you're going to build an MVC application, what you don't want to do is every time you want to add a new form, you don't want to have to think about how should I lay out my form in this application. All right, do I need to lay out the form so that labels are above my input elements? Do things go in tables? I don't want to have to think about those things. I want my conventions to handle all that. I want to know how it should look. So we're going to look at how we establish some UI conventions. That's really important with MVC because I mentioned this earlier, there's a lot of different ways to accomplish the same thing. If you want to build a form and you want to have some editor for like a title element or something like that, these are just some of the different ways you could accomplish the exact same thing. So you can use the string-based version. You can say, I want a text box for my title. Or you could actually, if you really want to, and I would never recommend doing this, you can write the raw HTML. You can make a raw input tag with, if you give it the right name and everything, it's going to model bind correctly. Because underneath the hood, that's really what these other helpers are actually doing. They're just spitting out HTML. They're just doing it in a way that it will take advantage of the ASP.NET, model state and things like that. So you could, if you really, really wanted to, you could just write raw HTML. You can use the Lambda-based versions of things. You can use, which we'll look at a lot at this in just a few minutes, you could use editor for it. So you could say, MVC, just spit out an editor for this property. We could say, render an editor for this model. We could say, okay, well, we're actually going to push all of our concerns for editing this title down to a partial. So render a partial here for editing the title. Which one of these are we going to use? We need to establish some conventions. That way, when we're working on a new feature or a new developer comes on, they're not left thinking about, okay, what's the right way to do this? We want it to be something that we're consistent throughout our application, and ideally, we want it to be something that we can take advantage of automatically. And that's actually what we're going to build. So this is, one of those big, strong, opinionated statements. Most of the time, you shouldn't be asking, how do I lay this form out? So you should ask that question once. So you should decide in your MVC application, this is the conventions I want for how my form is laid out. This is where I want things to be laid out. I want my validation messages to the right of my input elements. I want to have a top-down form, no tables. You should answer that question exactly once. After that, you should be able to take advantage of it seamlessly without having to think about it again. So you should not be asking, how do I lay this form out, except for that very first time. So how are we actually going to do that? So we're going to look at 3 forms that we have in Fail Tracker. Before we do that, any questions so far? Anyone want to argue over that statement? Arm wrestle or whatever? So here's our logon form, right? And let's look at our edit form. So this is our form for editing an issue. And let's look at our form for adding an issue. If you look at these 3 forms, there is a lot of repeated pattern here. Not necessarily repeated code, but just the pattern is repeated, right? So on my logon form, I have 1 line per element that I'm editing. I've got a label on the left, a text box on the right. I'm repeating that. Go to our form for editing an issue. It's the exact same pattern, right? So label for my title, text box for my title, label for the type, and a drop-down list for the type. I've got this same pattern showing up repeatedly. And it's if I don't bake this into my framework, I'm going to have to think about this every single time I want to add a new form to my application. I'm going to have to come back in here and edit this every single time I add a new property to one of my models that I want to have, show up on the form. So anybody want to do this? Like, would anybody enjoy having to copy and paste this around and do that? Anybody just really, really like writing HTML helpers, using HTML helpers? If you really, really like typing this stuff, then you will not like what I'm going to show you. So let's start with a simple one. Let's start with the logon page. So what if, instead of writing all this, I could just say HTML editor for model. What if I could do that? And what if, let's log out. What if I still got the exact same experience? I just took out that little bit of code, replaced it with one HTML helper call. It's not even really saying how to do anything. It's just saying, I want an editor. And I get the exact same form that I was explicitly specifying before. So let's take that further. So let's go to our add form. So here's our add form. This is how it's rendering. This is the actual code, or this is the Razor view for it right now. Quite a bit of code there. What if I could do the exact same thing? HTML editor for model. And then I could delete all of this and still have the exact same user experience. Is that an improvement? Would you rather just write editor for, or would you rather have to think about every single time, this is how I want to lay out my view? Droid. I love that.
How does it determine the order?
Excuse me?
How does it determine the order of the elements?
How does it determine the order of the elements? We'll look at that. I'm going to show you how this all works under the hood. Right now I just wanted to show you just magic stuff. So, all right, we can actually let's go to our editor. This is our editor for the issue. Do the exact same thing. HTML editor for See, I can't stand switching between so the resharper IntelliSense, the code completion, you can kind of type parts of things and then jump to the next word or whatever, and it takes care of it for you. The Visual Studio IntelliSense, for whatever reason, does not do that, and it's a nasty context switch. I hate making it. I really want ReSharper to finish up version 6. All right, so anyway, enough complaining. So we go to an issue, go to edit it, and we still got the exact same form that we had when we were specifying things every single, we were specifying explicitly, this is how I want the form laid out. So any questions on that? You guys can just, that's good enough, right? You don't want to see how it works. Yeah.
Does it take care of the validation errors in this internally by the same method?
So does it take care of the validation errors? Not right now, but we're going to do that. Yeah, because like I said, that's one of those things I don't want to have to think about. I want it to just work. So yeah, we're going to make that just work. But first we need to look at how we actually achieved this. How did we get this conventional UI? So what's going to happen is, let's start with a simple one. Let's start with the logon form. So I'm saying editor for model. Is anybody here familiar with the ASP.NET MVC templating support? Yeah, you guys, a couple of heads nodding, so a few people have used it. All right, for those that haven't, it's basically this conventional method for figuring out what partial view to use to render something. So we're saying, I want an editor for my model. The view knows that the editor is a logon form. It knows that, one, because I've told it, and it can also look at the actual model itself and see what type it is. So it knows that it's a logon form. So what's going to happen is MVC is going to look in my views. So this is an account view, so it's going to look in the account folder and see, do I have any editor templates? Do I have any editor templates for a logon form? It doesn't see anything here, so it's going to jump to my shared folder. So I know most everybody in here has done MVC before, but for those that haven't, the convention is that views are organized under this views controller based on whatever controller they belong to. So if we have an account controller, we'll have a folder named account. Our views related to the account controller go there. But there's also this shared folder, and this is where views that are across controllers can live. And we can also put templates in there that we want to our application to take advantage of regardless of the controller. So in my shared folder, let me fire up Zoom it real quick. Actually, I meant to do that. Zoom it. All right, so In my shared folder, I have display templates and editor templates. So Visual Studio actually ships with templates for just about everything. So you could actually, right now, without doing anything else, you could call editor for model, and you would take advantage of the stuff that's in the box, the default templates that MVC provides for editing a view, or editing a model. I don't really like the ones that are built in, so I built my own. And Brad Wilson has a great series of blog posts on these, and a lot of this is based on things that he's posted on there. But anyway, so what's going to happen? I said editor for model. It couldn't find an editor in my account folder, so it came here. It saw there is an editor templates folder. So now it's going to look and see, do I have a view here named blog on form? So that's the convention. If I'm saying editor for model, it's going to look and see, okay, what's the type of the model? Do I have an editor, a view that matches that name? So it's looking for blogonform.cshtml. I don't have that. So it's going to look and see, okay, do I have something more generic that I can apply? And I do. I have this object template. So this object template is really pretty simple. All it's doing, and if you're not familiar with some of the underlying model metadata stuff, this may be a little kind of confusing, but all I'm really doing is I'm looping through the properties that are defined on my model. I'm checking so that I only grab the ones that are actually editable. So I'm only grabbing the properties that have setters, basically. So I'm pulling those guys down, and for each one of those, I'm saying output an editor. So output an editor for this particular property. And again, we're getting into something kind of recursive here. We're telling MVC I want an editor for this particular property. So it's going to look and see, okay, what's the type of that property? So if we go back to our logon form, we're now looking at the email address. So it's going to see, okay, do I have an editor for string? And in the shared folder, sure enough, I have a string template. So in my string template, I'm just saying, when you're editing a string, I just want you to output a text box, and if there is a value associated to whatever property this is in the model state, go ahead and put it in the text box. That's really all I'm doing. But where is the label coming from, right? So I'm telling it to output a text box, but if on the UI I actually have a label there. So you can specify layout files, just like you can specify a master layout for your views. You can actually specify layouts for your templates. So if we go and look at our field layout template, here's where everything else is coming from. So our field layout template says render a opening p tag, render a label for our model, which in this case at this point in time it's actually going to be the property on our top level view model. Render a label for that, and then render the body of the template. So in this case, it's going to actually render the contents of our string template at that point in the template. Right? So pretty simple, right? Clear as mud. Yeah. So, and then it's just a loop. It's going to go through every single property on our view model and output, whatever template's appropriate, because I've wired them up so that they all have this, all of the editors have a template wrapping them. They're all going to get the same label. They're all going to be wrapped in a p tag. I don't have to do anything in each of my individual templates. That's handled at a higher level. Somebody asked a question earlier, where does the order come from? It actually is determined by the order of your properties in your class. So however you order things in your view model, that's how they're going to show up on your form.
Is it the email address that you mentioned in the text, is it the label caption?
Oh, yeah. So I haven't talked about the other things that are on this model yet. So there are a couple of things that I've got decorating my model properties here. The first one is this display name. So by default, when you call a label for model, which remember that's what our template's actually doing each time it's going to output an editor, it's calling label for model, it's going to look at the property name, and that property name is going to become our label. In this case, that's going to be a pretty ugly label. It's going to be email address all crunched together. What we can do instead is we can use this display name data annotation property or attribute and say, this is what I want you to show for the label. I want you to show email address with a space in it. I haven't gotten around to doing it yet with fail tracker, but you can actually, if you wanted to, you could specify some additional conventions that would take email address like this and automatically generate a label that's got a space in it. For right now, I just haven't gotten to that point with fail tracker, so I'm using the display name property or attribute here. But you could bake that into your framework so that you don't have to keep doing that. If all you really wanted to do was take your property name and put spaces, where you've got a case change, you could do that. You could bake that into your framework.
You lose stuff like different max lengths for text boxes or default values for drop-down. Is there any way to inject custom behavior into this kind of architecture?
There is. So you do lose control over the raw HTML to a point that it's getting generated. But we'll get to it when we start looking a little bit more at the validation stuff. There are a lot of different data annotation properties that I can specify. I can specify things like email address has to look like an email address. I can specify it has to be less than 50 characters. If I've got like an integer on there and I want to say, it has to be positive, I can do that. I can put all those things on my model here to say, this is how you should generate the UI. You need to enforce these things. That system's actually pluggable. So in one of the applications that I'm working on, we needed to be able to specify, additional HTML attributes, not just validation, but we needed to inject some additional attributes. And what we did is we wrote our own model metadata provider that plugs into the framework. So now we can add our own custom data annotations and have those picked up and injected into the framework, and then our templates can take advantage of those. So it's a very flexible system. You have about as much control over it as you want.
How do you, you mentioned earlier that the criteria for including it on the editor page was based on if they had a setter property, but is there data annotation to kind of override, maybe you want a setter for the purpose of your model for processing for some reason, maybe in your own code, but yet you don't
Yep.
prevent it from appearing to the user.
Yep. I think, and I don't, let me see if I can remember it off the top of my head. Yep, so read only.
Or even not even display it at all.
Oh, to just hide it?
Yeah, you maybe there's some data that you don't want the user to see, but you need it to be on the model for other kinds of processes.
Yep, and we'll jump ahead just a little bit. Form. So, so this is a great example. So the question was, what if you have something that you need it, on your model, but you don't necessarily want to allow the user to edit it or to see it. A great example of that is like our form for editing an issue. We need to capture the ID of what issue we're editing. That way we can send it back to the server so our action knows the edits that just came in, they're for this issue. So we can actually we can override the default behavior and tell our templating engine, we need you to render a hidden input for this particular field for this ID. In that case, it's actually not going to it's not going to output a label or any of that other stuff. It's just going to output a hidden HTML form input element. And it's going to, the model binder and stuff is still going to work exactly as it normally does.
What about localization for the label?
Localizations for the label. I'm not that familiar with the localization story on MVC just because I haven't had to do it yet. I do know that they have improved greatly the localization story for MVC3. I've seen examples where instead of specifying, use this string for this label, they're actually specifying, use localization, use this resource to localize.
Override display model. So I think you should. Most attributes they have overrides. What you could use to redirect your resource file. So if this is a resource type and a key, in the resource, every one of those has that override.
Yep. Oh, excellent. So so it's just basically another overload of some of these that you can use. So if you do have to do localization, fortunately I do not have to do that in my jobs right now. I do not envy you guys that do, but fortunately I don't have to. So I'm not that familiar with it. So good questions. Anything else? So let's see. So the nice thing about doing this, well, what's an alternative to this? So instead of just using editor for something like that, I could take more, maybe like a scaffolding approach or something like that. I could have a utility or something that will actually take my model and generate all that HTML for me. So it'll generate that HTML block that I originally had, all the labels, editors, stuff like that. I could do that. The problem is, what if I want to drastically alter the layout across my entire application? If I went the generate code approach, I've got to regenerate everything. And hopefully I didn't have to customize anything. Because if I did, now all that customization is gone. I've got to reapply it after I regenerate my code. Using this approach, say that right now we've got labels on the left, text boxes on the right. Say, for whatever reason I decided, okay, I just want to put the labels above the elements. So instead of having to go through and regenerate a bunch of stuff, I just come in here and edit my template. Edit my template, reload my view, and that's really ugly because of the CSS that's being applied, but actually we'll go ahead and clean that up. So that style is coming from site.css, line 34. And we'll just take that out. Yep. So small CSS change, small change to my template, and now every single form in my application looks like this.
Does the engine let you do finer grained differentiation other than just type? Say like you got there, say it was a side box, you wanted to stack on top, or somewhere else you want. Would you just do a CSS, or would you do? Is it quite a different template?
Yeah. So the question is, what if I want to, maybe override the templating behavior? I want to have a slightly different layout for, this particular form versus another. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a couple of ways you could do it. Wherever you can, my recommendation would be to use CSS to do it, if you can. A lot of times that's not going to be possible. The cool thing is that yes, that templating engine is completely overrideable. So if we go back to Visual Studio, remember right now all these forms are being rendered with our generic object template. If we wanted to, like say I wanted to have a custom form for the login page, for our, basically, let me see, that was the logon form. I can make an editor template. So new view, I just give it the name logon form. And I have to nuke a bunch of this stuff, but at this point I can write whatever custom layout I want for my logon form in here, and it's going to pick this up instead of picking up the generic object template.
The whole thing there rather than letting it fall down to string and do it up.
Yep, it's going to find this guy instead of finding the generic object template. Oh, so if you wanted to just override it, like...
No, I think
okay.
That's a perfect answer.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you wanted to, like say you wanted to, if you wanted to have, let me delete this real quick before I forget about it, because that's going to cause problems. Yeah, say I wanted to, for all of my views that are being rendered, off of the account controller, if I wanted to have a custom editor for just that area of the site, I can drop an editor templates folder here. I can add an object.cshtml view there, and it will apply only to views from that folder. And it will still, those views can still take advantage of my default editor templates, because when it can't find one here, it's going to fall back to the shared folder and pick them up from there. So yeah, it's really flexible. You can kind of override bits and pieces of it if you want. If for whatever reason though, you really, really need full control over the layout of a form, you can do that. There's nothing that stops you in your view. So let's go back to our add issue view. There's nothing that stops me from going in here and specifying this is exactly how this form needs to be laid out. I can do that. I don't have to use html.editor for model, but it's nice that that's baked into the framework. If 90% of the time I won't have to think about layout, I can just say editor for model and I'm done. Question?
How do you handle conditional display of elements? Because like now you get into the model, like you have 5 elements and it takes that and it displays that. But if you want an engine, a portal engine, which needs to have some conditions, and based on those conditions, I want to display only 3 elements rather than displaying all the 5 elements in the model.
So the question was, what if I want to have conditional element display? So I've got some fields on my form I only wanted to show if a certain condition is true. Again, we can go to our object template, and this is C# code, so I can write whatever code I want in there. So if I've got maybe certain fields that are only visible if the user's in a certain role, I can check the role right here. I could define my own custom data annotation property, tag it to the the properties that say in such a way that says these properties are only visible if the user's an admin. I can do that. I can take advantage of it here, and I can not show those. I can just skip right over them. Does that make sense? Question?
Can you unit test that code right there?
Can I unit test this code right here? No, I cannot. Unfortunately, you cannot unit test Razor directly. That is that's a bad thing. There are Jimmy Bogart gave a presentation at MVC Conf, the virtual MVC conference a couple of years ago, where he was taking advantage of maybe Selenium, I can't remember which one, but he was taking advantage of one of those testing frameworks that lets you automate the UI, automate the browser. But because he was generating his UI based on conventions, he could actually write his unit tests that are going to drive the browser built on those same conventions. So he was really writing something that looked exactly like a normal unit test, but it was actually executing stuff in the browser. So it was checking the actual functionality of the view itself. So that's a great presentation if you can find it online. It's one of those things where I've never really been given the time to look into it. I've never taken the time to do it. But yeah, that's definitely the route you would have to go. You'd have to do some browser automation. All right, so any other questions? All right. So we've looked at the editor templates. Actually, let me show you one more thing. So there is this one little bit of logic that's repeated still on all these guys. I've got, this div for my input element. Razor allows you to define helpers. So I can have a helper, let's call it control box. This is really, it's just a function that's going to return some, return something. In this case, we're going to return some markup. So string label, and we'll just return this guy. And instead of save, we'll just output whatever the label is. Now we can call control box, pass in save. So I can define a helper inline in my Razor template and kind of encapsulate some of that code. Doesn't really buy me anything though, right? I've still got that HTML on the page. I'm going to have to repeat this helper everywhere. One of the cool things about Razor is that you can actually put these kinds of helpers in your app code folder, and it will automatically generate a class for you that you can then call from everywhere. So I've got this my helpers file. It's just a normal Razor view that I've dropped in my app code folder, and I've defined a control box helper there. So if I go back to my edit here, I can actually say my helpers control box, and you can see there's my control box helper. Save. And all of this goes away. Yep. So you can kind of, that's it. In previous versions of MVC, if you wanted to have a helper that spit out a bunch of HTML, you kind of had to put the HTML in your C# code. You had to have a string or something like that was going to spit back this big ugly string of HTML. With Razor, we don't have to do that anymore. We can just drop a view with a certain name, or we can drop a view in our app code folder, put some helpers in there, and now we can take advantage of them everywhere in our site.
How does it do things like populating like radio buttons or drop-down combos with the valid selections for those?
So that's one of my big complaints about MVC is the whole drop-down list, that sort of thing. I really don't like how that stuff works. Most of the examples you look at, what they'll do is on their view model, they'll actually have a property, they'll stuff it in view state or something like that, that's going to have all the valid options. They'll do that, and then they'll tell the HTML helper, this is, where the properties are for this drop-down. The model binder at that point is really good. It'll look at, whatever property you generated the drop-down for, it'll look at its value, try to find a matching value in the list of things you told it were valid options, and it'll make sure it's selected. The model binder works pretty good. What I've done instead, let's actually take a look at that. So, let me close these. So I've got exactly that scenario, right? On my ad form, I've got, some drop downs on here. The assigned to, that's a list of users from the database. So what I've done, so what I've done is I've told MVC that this UI hint attribute, data annotations attribute, says when you go to render an editor for this assigned to field, I want you to use this template. Don't look at the name of the property, don't look at the data type, use this template. I'm overriding what it's going to do by default. And if you go and look at the user drop-down editor, I have an HTML drop-down list, and I'm passing in I've got a built-in HTML helper that will retrieve, and I don't like having this in my view, but at the same time, it's code that I'm pretty confident that I'm not going to be editing much, so I'm okay with it living here. I think I may change my mind tomorrow. But this is actually going to go and pull from the database a list of the valid users. It's going to populate them in the drop-down list, and because we're generating this based on the model, it's going to go ahead and model bind it to whatever user the issue is currently assigned to when I'm editing. So, yeah, I'm not really a big fan of how the drop-down stuff and the list box stuff is implemented in MVC. It's a little hacky. But the nice thing about this is I can push all that hackiness into my editors, and then I don't have to really think about it from day-to-day activities. I can just put the right UI hint attribute on my view model, and that's it. The templating engine will take care of everything else.
Well, in your models, you can almost expect that for every property that's a lookup property from some other table, you're going to need to put that UI hint thing on there. Otherwise, it wouldn't possibly bring valid choices in there for you.
Right, yeah, because if you have to tell it what options to show in the drop-down. You're right. You could solve this a little bit differently. Instead of using a UI hint, you could actually make like a view model, a nested view model that represents a user. And then you could say, when you're going to display an editor for this nested view model type, here's the template you use. At that point, we're falling back to using the conventions that are already established. We don't have to use UI hint. UI hint's not wrong. I mean, it is a string. You could fat finger it, but it's one of those things where it's not code you're going to be touching all that much. So I'm okay with using it in my applications.
Is it the same approach even for predefined values instead of like I don't get variables, I have predefined values to show?
So you have predefined values you want to show? It depends. If you have like an enum, something like that, so I'll show you how I handle enums. So issue type, this is built off an enum. So what I've got is a drop-down list, and I built this HTML helper, or an extension method, that I can call that will take the options from an enum and actually build up a list of a select list item collection, which is what the ASP.NET MVC drop-down list helper expects. It expects to have some IEnumerable of select list items. So I've got a helper method to kind of push that ugliness away from my day-to-day activities. And I think that's a perfectly valid use of an application framework, is to try, it's kind of like a rug, you pick it up, you put the ugly stuff that you don't want to have to think about, in day-to-day activities under there, and you just kind of hide it, out of sight, out of mind, right? So any other questions on that? So I'm not taking full advantage of it yet in Razor or in Fail Tracker because I'm not far enough in yet where I really see the use of the conventions yet. But you can establish conventions for UI for display as well. So there's editor templates and there's also display templates. So I can do the same kind of basic approach. I could, if I felt like I had an approach I wanted to always follow when I was displaying something, I could generate a template for that. I could take full advantage of the same templating engine for display as well as for editing. In my experience, display is a little bit harder to do because you may have some screens that look exactly the same, but there's, it just seems like there's always a little bit more customization that goes into display versus editing. Editing tends to be a little bit more consistent. Display, you may kind of, muck around with things a little bit to kind of, optimize things for how the user's actually looking at it. So keep that in mind. You can establish conventions for display as well, and I would recommend doing it where you can. But it's one of those things where I think you'll probably find that editor templates are something you're going to use a lot more frequently than display templates. All right, so any questions on that? So the convention that we have established is that we are going to use... The convention we established is that we're going to use editor for model to lay out our forms. We're not going to do manual form layout unless we really need to deviate from the conventions. Otherwise, we're going to take advantage of the templating. The next thing I don't want to think about is validation. In your day-to-day activities, you should not be asking, how am I going to do validation? You shouldn't have to think about that. You should know how that's going to work, and you should be able to take advantage of what your application framework can do for you. So, yeah, somebody asked the question about how does validation work? So let's look at that. Let's go to our, actually we got to back up a step. So I talked about at the beginning that MVC3 ships with jQuery. And new from MVC2 to MVC3 is that instead of using Microsoft's validation library for doing client-side validation, it actually uses the jQuery validate plugin. So if you've used jQuery before, you probably use that plugin. It's really a nice plugin. It's kind of ubiquitous at this point, but that's baked in. One of the nice things that Microsoft did in MVC3 is they made it transparent to take advantage of that. All you have to do, and if you make a new MVC3 project, these settings are going to be there by default. You just have to add 2 app settings, client validation enabled, and unobtrusive JavaScript enabled. Add those 2 attributes, or those 2 settings to your app setting with a value of true. And in your layout, be sure that you include both jQuery validate and, of course, the main jQuery library, as well as Microsoft's unobtrusive validation library. If you have both of those, now you're set up to do client-side validation. You don't have to write anything special. It's all going to take advantage. It's all going to look at your model, your view model, and generate client-side validation rules for you. So let's look at taking advantage of that. So let's log out. All right, so what we would really like is to say email address and password are both required and not allow the user to post back if they don't have those things, right? We want to show some kind of validation error here. I don't want to have to think about that every single time I lay out a form, though. I don't want to have to think about where does my validation message go. So let's look at our logon view first. So we're actually not going to make a single change to this view to take advantage of validation and add validation. We're not going to edit it at all. What we're going to edit is our logon form view model. So the ASP.NET, actually some of it's built into just the core .NET framework in version 4, even in 3.5. There's data annotations that we can apply to specify things like this field is required. In the MVC futures assembly, there's things that we can do like email address. So we can say this property is an email address. Only allow the user to enter a valid email address for this property. Password, we want to mark that as required as well. All right, and that's half of what I need to do. This is really, in the day-to-day development stuff, this is all I should have to think about. I should have to just look at, okay, these properties on my model, I want this one to be required, I want it to be an email address, and I want this one to be required. I'm specifying what I want, I'm not specifying how I want to do it. Right now, since we don't have that convention yet, we're going to have to think about how we're going to make this happen, but in day-to-day development, we won't have to do that anymore. Let's go to our field layout. So remember, this is a template that's being used to render every single input element on any of our forms across the site. So we can say HTML validation message. And the empty string stuff probably looks a little weird. So if you pass in an empty string in one of these templates, it's actually going to be smart enough to look at, okay, whatever your model is, that's what I'm going to render a validation message for. So you just kind of pass in an empty string. But what I've done now, if I've done this right, let me check my notes and make sure. Wouldn't want to have something go wrong in a demo, right? All right, so we're going to reload this form. Oops, we don't want to reload it that way, though.
I use empty string instead of an empty parameter list or null.
Because there's not an overload for that. It would have been nice if they'd done that. And actually, for some of the things, like the text boxes and things like that, there's actually an overload where you can basically do that. You can say render, an editor for basically the model. Validation message, for whatever reason, does not have that. No idea why. All right, so we'll take this out, this out. Let's try to submit our form. Boom. Validation errors. I didn't have to do anything really. I mean, I did have to enable it in my templates, but after that, I didn't have to do anything in the view itself. The validation messages are all coming from the conventions I've established. And since we tagged this one with an email address, it has to be a valid email address. We can't enter just garbage, it's going to catch it. So let's go back and log in just to prove that this works. So remember, all I did was edited my template, and I added a couple of properties to my model. In this case, let's go to the add form. This one I've already got data annotation attributes on for required and for things like that. So when we go to add, we're already taking advantage of it. I don't have to do anything else. I don't have to edit my view. This is a concern that's now baked into my framework. All I have to do is just add the data annotation attributes to my view model. My framework, my application framework, is going to take care of everything else. So
these are the standard elements.
Yeah, I did not. You can override these if you want to. There's overloads for required and things like that where you can pass in a string. I'm not sure how the localization stuff would work. I don't know if it would be smart enough to go and look up a key. I doubt, or will it?
It's the same.
Okay, so you still have to use an overload. Yeah, to use an overload. Yeah.
And usually redirect it to a message.
Yeah. All right, so the convention we've established is in day-to-day development activities, when I'm laying out a form, I'm not going to worry about validation. I'm going to trust that my application framework is going to handle it. So any questions on that? All right, so this next convention is a pretty minor one, but it's an important one. It's about managing complexity. You want to establish conventions for where your JavaScript and your CSS are going to live, and you want to do that immediately. This isn't one of those things where you're going to wait until you have a mess and then come back and try to establish conventions. This is one of those things you need to do up front. You need to decide, are you going to follow HTML conventions, which are JavaScript goes in external files, we source it in, CSS goes in external files, we link it in, Are we going to follow those? Or are we going to put JavaScript directly in our views? Are we going to put CSS directly in our views? We need to make those decisions up front. I can tell you what I like to do. Let's see. I can tell you what I like to do, and this is, feel free to ignore it. I like to follow kind of the same convention. I do like to follow HTML conventions. I like to put my JavaScript in a separate file. I like to put my CSS in a separate file for the most part. But I like to follow the conventions that MVC has for the views folder. So the views folder, you've got a shared folder. This is where views that are kind of, across your site, that's where those go. And then you've got a folder for your different controllers that views for that controller go. I like to follow that same convention for my scripts as well. So I've got, under my scripts folder, I've got an issues folder. I have an issues controller. So any scripts that are specific to views that are returned by my issues controller, I'm going to put them here. That way my scripts folder kind of mirrors how the views folder is organized. And it, for me at least, it kind of makes it conventional. I know if I'm editing the dashboard view, I want to go see if it's got some custom JavaScript, I know exactly where to look. I know where that JavaScript's going to live. I like to do the same thing for CSS as well. I don't have any custom CSS yet. Everything is just global styles. I'm a big fan of that if you can. If you can, CSS should be one of those things that you don't have to do a lot of, real fine grain. This is how this particular element looks. It's much better, I think, if you can set some kind of broad rules that are going to apply everywhere. One, it keeps your CSS smaller. Two, it cuts down on conflicts between different styles. You end up having, you don't have to start doing like, oh well, I need to tag this one with important. That way it overrides some other global one. So try to keep your CSS generic where you can. So far in Fail Tracker, I've been able to do that. In other applications, I haven't. I've had some view-specific JavaScript or CSS, and I've used the same structure as my views folder to organize that. So that's a real easy convention. You don't necessarily have to do what I do, but I do think you need to ask that question, where is my JavaScript going to live? Where is my CSS going to live? What conventions am I going to follow? You need to ask those and establish those early on.
I can do the same thing, but with NuGet packages, it seems like they have their own way they want to, go down and get jQuery UI. It has its own convention for it, wants to put everything. So how do you deal with that?
What I do is I just drag it where I want it after that. I let it go ahead and add it wherever it wants it. I drag it where it goes. If I need to update the package, it's going to, come back and put it back in the same spot. I've got to manually kind of fix that. That's how I've solved it. But yeah, you're absolutely right. We don't have in the .NET community conventions that are much broader than that as far as how we organize our CSS and JavaScript. You kind of define that at your application level, and that's where we're at. Question?
Yeah, how can you add HTML attributes validation fields?
Excuse me?
How can you add HTML attributes on validation fields? For example, you're showing if email is invalid, you're showing an error message. That comes with built-in data attributes.
Right.
Now, if you want to add new HTML attributes, for example, let's call it as client selected, and you want to set that property to true or something like that.
Okay, so you want to be able to specify some additional properties on your view model. The question was, how can I specify additional properties on my view model and have those translated to my HTML, basically? Like, how can I have attributes mapped from my view model to my input elements or something like that?
Right, but only if the validation is validation phase, not all the time. So, is it possible to do that?
I think you can specify a custom model metadata provider that will, then you can do pretty much whatever you want as far as pulling metadata from your view model and passing it to the view. But at that point, I think you'd probably have to do some JavaScript to, add these, add whatever attribute you want or toggle whatever flag you want whenever a field's in an invalid state. I think at that point you'd have to do some JavaScript.
Okay, but how do you know if the validation is when you're using the jQuery validation method?
Yeah, so there's some events and things that you can hook into. There's different callbacks, I think. Pretty sure there's a callback, but if not, there's checks you can do. So you could say, every time one of my input elements changes, fire this event. Then I can actually call the form. I can look at the form and say, is the form in a valid state? If not, then I can grab all the invalid elements and do whatever I want to. So it's one of those things where you're going to have to probably get into some JavaScript as opposed to something you can solve in MVC. You could bake that into your framework still, though. As we'll look at, you can have JavaScript that's part of your framework, your application framework. All right, so any other questions? Is anybody else getting really hungry? Yeah. Like I said, if anybody wants to step out and grab some food, it won't hurt my feelings at all. But all right, so next convention. Layer supertypes are a good thing. Does anybody know what I mean by a layer supertype? So in WebForms, for those of you that have done WebForms, have you ever made, instead of having your ASP.NET web pages, instead of having them inherit from the base page class, if you put your own kind of middle layer in there, like a base page class for your application, and had your pages inherit from that instead? Yeah, see a few heads nodding? That's a layer supertype, right? So basically what we're talking about is making our own custom base classes that kind of sit between the lower level ASP.NET base classes and our application classes. So layer supertypes are a good thing. That's a great place to put common functionality for your framework, things that you want to bake into your framework. You can put those into those layer supertypes. So let's look at where we might want to do that. So let's close all this out. In this case, we're going to implement a supertype for our controllers. So let's go to the issues controller. So our issues controller, right now it inherits from the controller class. That's core MVC. We've got this authorize attribute on there. Every single controller that I add to fail tracker that I don't want users to be able to see without being logged in, I'm going to have to remember to come back and add that authorize attribute. One good use of base classes and MVC, or base controller classes, is that I can have a authorized controller, like a base abstract. Fail tracker. I can make a base controller type, and any controller that I want to have protected so that users have to log in before they access it, I just make it inherit from this super type instead of the base controller type. So this is a pretty simple example, but as we'll see, this actually has a lot of use. I can start building conventions to ensure that things that should be protected are protected. I can catch those before they make it to production. So I also like to, instead of, I've got some common functionality that I want to apply to all my controllers in fail tracker, so I can do that. I can just make a base fail tracker controller. And I can make sure this guy needs to inherit from that as well. So instead of inheriting from controller, I'm just going to inherit from fail tracker controller, and I'm going to put any common cross-cutting controller logic in there as opposed to having to copy and paste it around in all my different controllers. I can tell you one place where I've taken advantage of that recently is in a project where we're actually trying to, and we've been successful with it, but it's an ASP.NET WebForms application, and we're moving MVC into it. That's pretty well documented, it's pretty common. The thing we're doing that's different that really is painful is 90% of our application logic is in a single page. It's one page in the site. It's a tab control with a bunch of nested controls in it. That's our application, is that one page. So you can't take the usual MVC approach of swapping out one page at a time when you have something like that. So what we came up with was an approach that will let us write controllers and actions just like we normally would in an MVC application and have those rendered and injected inside the web form. So we now can start swapping out pieces of that web form, moving pieces of it at a time to MVC. And we did that by overriding, well, if I can get the IntelliSense. So we overrode the base view here. So anytime we return a view result from any of our controllers, we add on some additional logic to what happens to that view. I won't get into too many of the details about how this actually works. I've actually got a blog post that covers some of it, but we're having to kind of decorate that view as it comes back. That way it's safe to inject into a web form. And instead of having to have that nasty logic every single place in our application or having to deviate from how you would normally write MVC, we've baked that into our framework. So it's in the base, our layer super type. And we don't have to think about that in day-to-day activity anymore. That ugly code, and it is ugly code, is once again swept under the rug. So you don't have to look at it in day-to-day activity. All right. So getting into kind of a lessons learned convention here, you shouldn't have to ask, are my actions protected from unauthorized viewers? Especially going back to the early MVC apps I did, I can't tell you how many times we released something to production where we forgot to put that authorized attribute on something. So we had a controller that was meant to only be accessible to somebody that was logged in. We forgot the attribute. It happens so many times. It's an easy thing to forget. So what we want to do, we've solved part of that. We've got a base class now where we can just say, you know, this controller inherits from our secure controller. Now only people that are logged in are going to be able to access it. That's not good enough though. You know, it's still really easy for somebody to make a new controller and to forget to change the base type. And they do that and boom, we got a controller in production that, you know, somebody can hit without being logged in. So what are we going to do? We're going to write a unit test. That's exactly right. That's exactly what we're going to do. First, let's replicate this bug. So let's say we have an admin controller. Actually, I'm just going to use the templates. So we're going to make an admin controller. And we're going to forget to have this inherit from our super type. We're just going to make it inherit from controller. We're going to leave off the authorize attribute. And we're going to make an action that returns something really, really important. We don't want people to be able to get it unless they're admins. So what?
Birthday.
Birthday. All right, we do want to use a layout master. All right, so let's go ahead and build this. So admin super secret page. I guess it would help if I logged out. So let me log out and try to go back to that same page. So at this point I'm logged out. I should not be able to go to admin super secret page and get anything, but I can because I forgot to put that authorize attribute on there. And that's really common. That's a really common mistake with MVC. So we're going to write a unit test to enforce this. So let's see. It's going to be a little bit of reflection magic here. All right, so we're going to go to our unit tests, and we're going to add a new in-unit test fixture. So this, we're going to call this app convention verifier. So for right now, we're just going to write a unit test or a couple of unit tests to verify that our controllers are inheriting from the right classes or the classes we expect. But we could also eventually hang some other checks for other conventions off here as well. So go ahead.
The post shop offers you doing this check in compile time. You can check that in compile, making sure that every controller is running from certain time.
Mm-hmm. Yep, so PostSharp apparently has that functionality built into it. There's also FXCop and things like that that can do some of the same things. Personally, I like doing it with a unit test just because I'm more comfortable with that. I have no problem using reflection to do checks like that. But yeah, there are other tools that will let you achieve the same thing. So we're going to go ahead and make a test. All my controllers inherit from fail tracker controller. All right. So first thing we need to do is grab all of our controllers. So we're going to use link to do that. So we're going to say from T in type of fail tracker controller dot assembly. If you haven't done much with a reflection, this may look Greek to you, but that's fine. I'll explain what it's actually doing. But so for all of the public types from our web assembly, where not t.is abstract and not t is interface and type of iController, because we only want to get controllers from our project, so we're going to say from type of iController is assignable from T. And I really hate the way this reads, but what this actually says is only return types that implement iController or the iController interface. It looks backwards, but that's what that actually says. So select T. So this gives me all of my controllers from my web project. So now I have a IEnumerable of those. Now I want to look and see, do I have any that don't actually inherit from the right type? So controllers with wrong base from C in controller. That should really be named controllers. From C in controllers, where type of fail tracker controller is assignable from C. And we want to check where things are not assignable to fail tracker controller, which means they don't derive directly or indirectly from that base type. Select C. All right, so if that IEnumerable has anything in it, that means we have at least one controller that inherits from the wrong type that's not using our layer super type. So we can use inunit, assert, excuse me? Assert you suck. Yep, so we can do that. We could tell them they suck and just leave it at that. We can also, though, if we want, we could say, you know, controllers. So we could, or let's call these bad controllers. So we can actually grab the names of those guys. So we can say string.join, build up a nice little string list of all these controllers. Let's see that name. It's not namespace, we just want the name. Name.toArray. So now we have a list. This string bad controllers is now going to be a comma separated list of any controllers in our application that do not derive directly or indirectly from our fail tracker controller. You suck. Bad controllers. Alright, and let's run this and see what we get. So, test failed. You suck. Utility controller, account controller, and admin controller. These guys do not inherit from the right super type. So I don't get compile time checking to make sure that I've actually got all my controllers derived from the right place, but I do now have it covered by a unit test. So I can go in and fix those. So admin controller. I know that needs to be a fail tracker controller. Utility controller. That needs to be a fail tracker controller. And then the last one was account. Yeah. So account controller. Fail tracker controller. So rerun our test. And it passed. So now we know, we can be sure going forward that if somebody adds a controller to our project, it will have to derive from this type, our base controller type, or it's going to fail. So that's part of the convention we wanted to establish. We also want to be sure that, and I'm going to cheat, I'm just going to, instead of making you guys watch me write more link, I'm just going to copy this. We also want to be sure that all of our controllers, with the exception of our controller that's got the logon form, we want all of those controllers to derive from our secured controller. So once again, we're going to grab a list of every controller in our interface, or in our project, where they are not assignable from secured fail tracker controller. And we do need to add a little bit more checking. We don't want this to fire for like the account controller. So where C is not equal type of account controller. So really all we're doing here is we're just excluding the account controller. I'm actually going to also go ahead and exclude the utility controller. That's a testing thing I've got in there for like resetting the database and things like that. So I want to be sure I can call that even if I'm not logged in case I break the database and can't get logged in. So all my controllers are properly protected. So this test for this convention is basically saying the only two controllers that are allowed to inherit from something besides the secured version of our layer super type are the account controller and our utility controller. If any other controller does not inherit from that type, fail the test and get the developer to fix it. So let's run that. All right, and it failed. Admin controller is not protected. That one definitely should be, right? So secured fail tracker controller, rerun our test. Test passes. And if we try to access this page now, excuse me? Yeah, I just ran the one test. So now when I tried to access that super secret page, it punted me to the logon page, which is what I want. So any questions on that? That code is kind of nasty to check for that, but again, that's one of those things that you only have to write it once. And after that, it's kind of swept under the covers of your framework, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. You can just rest assured that if somebody adds a new controller, you're going to get an error. Either they're going to get it, or if they commit it, they're going to get it from the build server that says you've got a controller deriving from the wrong type. So you can enforce that convention with a unit test. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about how you can start pushing the how to do things into your application framework. That way, when you're writing code, you just specify what you want. And a great way to do that is the action result class. So all of your MVC actions are going to return an action result, right? The most common one that you return is, view. This actually returns a view result. But we can build our own action results. And there's actually, let's look at that real quick. There's a ton of action results that are built in to, there's a ton of action results that are built into MVC out of the box. And then there's a ton more that are also in the MVC futures assembly. So there's things like, the atom feed result. Let's see what else we had from the futures. Data contract XML. MVC contrib used to have quite a few custom action results. I think most of those have kind of been absorbed into the main MVC framework, so they've gone away from MVC contrib. But there's just a ton of different action results, and nothing stops us from making our own or from extending some of these to add additional functionality to them. So that's what we're going to look at doing right now. So if we look at our account controller, so here's where we're getting into telling our application how to do something instead of telling it what we actually want it to do. So when the user logs in, if they successfully log in, we're taking advantage of forms authentication. This is just standard ASP.NET code. We're setting the auth cookie, and then we're redirecting them to the login page. What we actually want is to log the user in, and that's it. That's really what we want our application to do, is log the user in. Instead, our action method here is actually saying how to accomplish that. It's a subtle distinction. Instead of saying what you want, you're saying how to do it. What we can do is push this down a level. And actually, we need to do that if we want to write a unit test around this. So forms authentication, set auth cookie, if we call the unit test that tests the logon method here to make sure it works, it's actually going to blow up right now, because forms authentication is checking probably for HTTP context, which doesn't exist in a unit test. It's going to get a null reference exception. It's going to blow up. So you can't write unit tests around this thing the way it exists today. What I can do instead is push all that to an action result. So instead of doing that manually, I'm just going to say return a logon result. Oops. Logon result, form.email address. So again, it's a subtle distinction, but now I'm telling my application framework what I want to have happen. I'm not worried anymore about how it accomplishes that. I'm just saying log the user in. I don't care how it happens. I don't care how it's implemented underneath. Just do it. And we can do the same thing for logging off. Return new log off result. And another nice thing about this is that the tests become a lot more readable. And you can actually write tests around it now. So we go to the specs. So when requesting, when logging in with a valid username, let's look at the test for that. Instead of having to set up a bunch of mocks or something like that to verify that it's actually, calling forms authentication, sign in, all that, all I really have to do is just check that the result that it returns is actually a logon result. And I can check and make sure, it has the right email address for, the user, that it captured that correctly. That's all I have to do now. I don't have to worry about setting up any mocks or anything like that. I can just check that the return type is correct. So we'll go look at the code for this. It's really not that much. So if you want to implement a custom action result, all you have to do is derive from action result. If you want to extend the behavior of an existing one, you can do that. You can make a custom view result or something like that. You can also, if you're familiar with the decorator pattern, you can actually decorate an existing action result, and we'll actually look at an example of that if we have time. There's only one method you have to implement for an action result. That's execute result. So that gets passed in a controller context, and at that point, the action result is free to do whatever it wants. It's free to execute however it needs to. In this case, our action result is actually doing those little bits of untestable code. It's calling forms authentication, set off cookie, username. After that, it's just making a redirect result. So it's actually wrapping the behavior of another result type and executing it. So we're saying make a redirect result to take us to the home page and execute it. So not a lot of code here. We didn't really move that much out of our controller, but it's a subtle shift that's important. You know, like I said, we went from thinking about this is how this needs to work, or this is how you implement this functionality, to saying this is what it needs to do. Does that make sense?
So set off cookie does not require you to be context?
Set off cookie does, yep. So we cannot actually write a unit test around this logon result. So yeah, that part kind of sucks. If you wanted to, if you really wanted to have a unit test around these 2 lines of code, you'd have to start introducing mocks and something like that. And then you're still, at some point, going to have this line of code in your application somewhere that's not testable.
Oh, I see. Because then you want to create this
Yeah. So yeah, that's one of the pitfalls of unit testing in MVC. There's still going to be little edge cases where you can't really fully test all the way to the edge of the application. You're going to hit some point where you cross over and it's doing something with the ASP.NET pipeline that you can't really mock out. And one of those cases is like here, setting an off cookie. That's doing something under the hood, probably with the static HTTP context that doesn't exist. Boom, your unit test blows up. So kind of sucks, but fortunately those are kind of edge cases, and we can push those away and not really think about them much. All right, any other questions so far? All right, so we're about to get to the other tool. So I mentioned there's 2 tools that I've used on every MVC project, and there's a third one that I've used on almost every single MVC project. Yeah, somebody just said AutoMapper, and yeah, that's exactly what we're about to get into. So do not waste time copying properties from your domain type to your view model by hand. That is horribly painful code to write. It's very easy to fat finger and mess it up. It adds a lot of extra unit testing that you have to do, because if the code is in your controller, you really should be testing it in your unit test. It's just a huge waste of time. Let's look at, right now in Fail Tracker, remember I really mucked this guy up on purpose. So let's look at the issue controller. Let's see how we're mapping from our issue domain type to our view model. So the dashboard, all we're really displaying, let's take a look at the dashboard. Dashboard, we really just have, we have a table. We've got the story type, title, size, and assigned to. Nothing much there. This is the code to map from our domain type to our issue view model. That's a lot of code, and it's code that's tedious to write. It's very easy to screw it up. If I accidentally, maybe I leave out the ID or something, now my view is not actually going to get the ID, and that's a logic error. That's not something that, any amount of compile time checking can catch for you. So yeah, that one's pretty bad. Let's look at the details. So yeah, if you want to actually view the details of an issue, here's how you map from the domain to the view model. Really pretty code, right? So yeah, I don't want to write this. It was painful to break Fail Tracker to actually make it, have this, as opposed to just taking advantage of the infrastructure and doing it the right way. Yeah, so this is tedious. It's error prone, and fortunately, you don't actually have to do that. There's a better way. So AutoMapper, that is the third library, the one that I've used on almost every MVC project I've ever done, and the 2 that I didn't use it, in hindsight, I wish I had. So AutoMapper is a great tool. If you're doing MVC stuff, definitely check it out. What AutoMapper does is conventionally will copy from one type to another. So we can tell AutoMapper, hey, I want you to be able to map from issue, which is my domain type, to the issue view model. And when we actually come back and ask AutoMapper to perform that mapping later, it's going to look for properties on our issue and see if there's a corresponding property with the same name on our issue view model. And where it finds matches, it's going to copy them over. It's very flexible. You can override the conventions. We can actually say, if we had maybe a date over here in our issue and we wanted to map it to a string, AutoMapper can do that, so that we don't have to worry about any conversion or anything like that. We can let AutoMapper take care of it for us. So yeah, so just looking at this example, ID, title, description, the property names are the exact same on our view model, so no problem there. AutoMapper is going to map that right over. It's going to get to this property though, assigned to email address. What we actually want to show on the form is the email address for the user that the issue is assigned to. If we go back to our domain, we don't actually have an assigned to email address. we have an assigned to property that's a user. Now this is an actual user object. Underneath that, the user object actually has an email address. AutoMapper, without you having to do anything else, is smart enough to see assigned to email address and figure out what you actually want is the email address property from the user that's in this assigned to property. So without having to write any code and tell AutoMapper how to do it, it will reach in there, grab the email address, and put it in your view model. So it's very cool. It even handles null checking and stuff like that. So it's not like it's going to blow up if the issue's not assigned to anybody. It's going to see assigned to as null, so I'm just going to assign null to this. So, make sense? Very, very handy tool. So let's look at how we can take advantage of that. So, first thing I'm going to do is go to my global. All right, so I do have, just ignore, pretend this mapping bootstrapper is not there right now. That's where I actually meant to take that out, but. So AutoMapper has this static mapper class, and this is our entry point into AutoMap. So this is where we do have to tell AutoMapper what types it should be able to map to and from. So we do have to tell it, you need to know how to, or you should support mapping an issue to an issue view model. We have to actually tell it that. So we're going to say create a mapping from an issue to an issue view model. All right, and go back to our controller real quick. So we have issue view model, and we have issue details view model. We want to be able to map our issue to both of those. So map issue to issue details view model. All right, and now what we can do go back to our controller. Let's start with just the dashboard first. This mapping code that we're writing by hand here, we can take all that out. We can just select the issue. And we are going to go ahead and convert it to an array. I'm using, actually we don't even need that let assigned anymore. I'm using in-hibernate link under the hood, which is, if you guys have used it, it's still a little glitchy. But what we're going to do is, we've got our issues, now we're going to ask AutoMapper to map from issue to issue view model. We're going to pass in our domain type. So all that mapping code I had before, I've now done with a single statement. I've asked AutoMapper to take my issue that I retrieved from in-hibernate and map it to my view model. So just to prove that this still works, and hopefully it does, hopefully I didn't screw something up. Whoops. Reload this. All right, and we get almost the exact same output. One thing you might not have noticed that changed is, look at my users now. Assigned to is not what we want. We actually want an email address there. So the reason for that is if we actually look at our view model, so if we go to our issue view model, you can see our property name is assigned to. So we're actually saying we want you to grab your property, you know, the value for this property from the issues assigned to. In this case, it's just going to convert from a user to a string by doing toString on it. And that's why we get that, you know, castle proxy type, because that's what in-hibernates, you know, the in-hibernate proxy type is going to return when you call toString on it. There's a way we can bake a little bit into AutoMapper. We can override some of the conventions and fix that. But we could also, you could take the approach that we're going to take for the issue details view model. So instead of manually doing all this, we're just going to say mapper.map from issue to issue details view model. And this is actually going to recursively go through and populate this. So if we look in our view model, we've actually got nested view models. We've got a list of changes as well. We've got, you know, basically an audit log of this is what's happened to the issue. So it's actually going to go through and map that thing as well from our issue domain type, which has, you know, an IEnumerable changes on it. Yeah, IEnumerable change. So it's going to map that for us. We don't have to do anything else. We do, now that I think about it, we do need to tell AutoMapper how to map that type though, we need to be able to say, create a mapping from a change, which is a domain type, to a change view model. All right. So our issue controller, we just took out, 20 lines of code probably for this one single action. Another nice thing is that now I don't have to worry about unit testing that property mapping in my controller. I don't have to make test cases that verify I copied properties correctly. I've pushed that responsibility into my application framework. In this case, I'm letting AutoMapper do it, and I don't have to check for that anymore. Let's see. Let me check one thing real quick. I want to be sure, leave time for the good stuff. Okay. All right, so if we go and actually view one of these, still get the same result. Notice again, it's still not mapping the created by correctly, but it does have the right thing for the assigned to. And that's because if we go and look at our view model, our issue details view model, we don't have just assigned to, we have assigned to email address. So in this case, AutoMapper's conventions are going to look inside the assigned to property on our domain type, pull out the email address and put it here. It's not going to do that for created by. If we renamed created by to created by email address, now it's going to grab the email address. But we can actually, we'll see, we can actually solve that problem a different way. We can specify how to convert from a user object to a string. Before we get to that, so this little bit of code, you're going to have to write this for every single type of mapping you want to support. And a lot of times it's going to be just this one line of code that says create a mapping from my domain type to my view model, my domain type to my view model. Sometimes we will want to override that behavior, we'll want to add some additional stuff to it, and AutoMapper will let us do that. But I don't want to have to write this, I don't want to have to maintain this code for every single view model in my application. So, once again, I'm going to use reflection to do just a little bit of magic. Actually, this is the next convention. Mappings should be automatically loaded and verified. So what that means is I don't want to have to create those mappings by hand. I want that to happen magically. I want my application framework to take care of it for me. And I also want my unit test to tell me if my mapping is invalid. So how can we make that happen? We're going to use our mapping bootstrapper. So I'm not going to write the code by hand here. We'll just look at it. So when the application starts up, we're going to call our mapping bootstrapper, and we're going to tell it to load all the maps. So what does that mean? Well, I've created this interface, IMapFrom. So what's going to happen is when we load our standard mappings, it's going to go through every type in our web application, look for any types that implement this generic interface, and based on that interface, we're going to create the AutoMapper mapping. We're going to basically call mapper create map from our domain type to our view model. And we're going to use this interface anywhere that we would, not need to override the AutoMapper conventions. Anywhere we would just want the default AutoMapper conventions, now all we have to do is implement an interface. So if I go to my issue view model, if I just want to take advantage of the default conventions, I just say I map from issue. Oh, namespace. Dang it. I map from issue. That's it. So I don't have to manually write that AutoMapper statement anymore. I don't have a separate file where I'm defining all that crap. Now it actually lives with my view model. I just say this view model is mapped from issue. There's no real logic that goes along with it. It's just a marker interface. But now if I need to change how this mapping works, if I need to change my view model, I only have one place in my application to go. I go to my view model. I don't have a separate place where I'm having to manually set up mappings and maintain all that. So this works really well for simple cases, but what if I do need to override the AutoMapper behavior? What if I want to tell AutoMapper maybe not to map a property? So my bootstrapper also loads custom mappings. So I have another interface. I have custom mappings. So it's going to go through there, look for any type that implements that, and that interface has a single method, create mappings. It's going to call that and pass in the AutoMapper configuration. So let's see. I think I may have skipped a step. Yeah, we also need to add to our, let's see, issue view model. That one's mapping. This one's also issue details. We're going to If I don't do this, it's going to blow up when I go to run it. So I map from issue. All right, so let's close all but that. So if we do need to change the behavior of AutoMapper, if we want to customize the mapping, we just implement a slightly different interface that actually will give us access to AutoMapper configuration and let us, specify some overrides. For the edit issue form, that's what I need to do. This form actually has a property, this comments property, that's not defined on our issue type. It's not defined in our domain model. So we need to tell AutoMapper not to try to map that, because if AutoMapper sees that comments property, sees that there's no mapping type or no corresponding property on the domain type, it's actually going to treat that as an invalid mapping. So we can tell AutoMapper that that's okay. We're going to say create a mapping from issue to the edit issue form. And for the comments property, just ignore it. Don't do anything. We intentionally are not mapping that. So once again, I now have one place in my application that I have to go if I want to customize how things are displayed for view. If I want to change, what's required, I come in here to my view model, I just change some attributes around. If I want to change how something's mapped, I go to my view model. Just change one method, change one interface. I have one place in my application that controls how things are displayed. So there's one more thing. AutoMapper, there's lots of different methods on this Fluent interface, for specifying how things should be mapped. So if we wanted to, change how the title was mapped, we can do that. We could even map it from a completely different property if we wanted to. And we could use something like this to handle that assigned to column. So remember, right now our assigned to column says like castle.user.proxy, whatever. We could write code in every one of our mappings to handle that and say, when you're mapping from a user to a string for the assigned to property, we want you to actually pull it from the email address. We could do that here, but then again, that's something else we have to think about every time we set up a view model. So again, we're going to bake that into our application framework. So AutoMapper also supports, that's interesting. I have some hanging resharper stuff there. Yay. That's really annoying. That's got to go away. And it's still there. Wow. Okay, there we go. So that was user to string. Okay, sorry about that. Little resharper fun there for you. So AutoMapper supports type converters. These allow you to specify how you convert from one type to another. So for example, say you have a date-time structure in your domain type, and you're using date times in a lot of different places, and you always, when you're rendering that in a view, you want to render it as a string for some reason. You can tell AutoMapper how to make that conversion from a date-time object to a string. You can say, always call .toShortDate or something like that. That way you're in full control over how that mapping occurs. In this case, we're actually going to use that same functionality for specifying how we take a user object and convert it into a string for display on the form. So we implement the type converter interface. We say we're going to convert from user to string, and this complicated, well, that's not even really complicated. This little block of logic here, all that really says is if there is no user, so if we're mapping from a null property, just return null. We're just going to assign null to the view model. Otherwise, we're going to grab the user and we're going to assign their email address to that string on the view model. And notice that this type converter actually inherits from our I have custom mappings interface and has the hooks into AutoMapper here to register the type converter. That means that we don't have to do anything else. We just make the type converter, have it implement this interface, and our mapping bootstrapper is automatically going to take care of registering it. We don't have to do anything else. So with all these pieces in place, what we should see is that castle.proxies.userProxy change to the username, or the user email address. And it does. So once again, the convention that we've established is we're not going to, unless we can really, really avoid it, we're not going to manually map from our domain types to our our view models. We're going to let the framework take care of that. We're not even going to worry about how we register stuff to be mapped. We're just going to have a simple marker interface that we can put on our views, which is where all our other view specific logic is going anyway. We're going to put it on our view model and let the framework take care of it. So there's one last thing we want to look at, automatically verifying that our mappings are correct. So once again, we're going to use a unit test for this. So what we want to have happen is for at test time to get an error if something's wrong. So if we've got a mapping that's not correct, if we screwed something up in our bootstrapper and the mappings aren't being loaded, we want to find out about that before we get to runtime. So we've got this mapping bootstrapper specs class, and we got two tests in here. The first one is just checking AutoMapper to see, okay, you should have some types loaded up. And if it doesn't, we're going to get an error. And then finally, this one's really easy. AutoMapper has this assert configuration is valid. So you can call this and it will throw an exception if you have an invalid mapping. So if you have, let's make that fail. The test is worthless until you see it fail, right? Let's go to our edit issue form. Red green refactor, that's right. So let's take that out. So we were telling AutoMapper it's okay that the comments property has no corresponding property in our domain. Just ignore it. Let's take that out. Let's take that out and let's run our bootstrapper. So AutoMapper tells us exactly what's gone wrong. It says the following one properties on our edit issue form are not mapped, comments. So the same kind of thing is going to happen. Let's say maybe we typoed something. Instead of saying assign to, we actually, had a typo somewhere in there, so it no longer maps to our underlying issue class. AutoMapper is going to catch that and tell us at test time that our mapping's not set up right, that we need to fix it.
What's the scenario where you have a property on a view model that there's not a supporting feature on the back end somewhere? How does it persist from?
Yep. So yeah, specifically, why do I have this comments property on my view model, right?
Yes, if there's not a corresponding back-end property on the back end, you're just having fun with your users maybe.
Yeah, so actually this is mapped to the domain, it's just not mapped to the issue type. So what happens is this edit issue form, we're going to populate it with our existing issue. So we're going to map in the properties from that, display it on a form. We're going to have that comments box on there. The user's got to enter some comments for why they're making that edit. When they post it back, the form's still going to have that property stored in the view model, and our controller is actually going to take that and call a method on our issue domain to say, this is why we're making these changes. So we are using it in the domain, it just doesn't map directly to a property on the issue type. It actually gets stored in that changes collection. So that's where that actually goes to. Does that make sense? All right, so let's fix this, make sure our test passes. All right, and 2 tests passed, so yep. All right, so any questions on that? I'll be honest, I've done something similar to this about 10 different ways about having some kind of convention for registering the AutoMapper mappings. So I may change my mind tomorrow. I may decide I don't like the marker interface approach. But I do think you should have some kind of convention that says if you're going to set up mappings in AutoMap, this is where those mappings live. This is how they're registered. For issue or for fail tracker right now, I like just having the marker interface and having this conventional way that I can override that if I need to. Question?
Yes. So I think it looks really good, but you still have to type each property twice into 2 different classes. Is there any way to use maybe like inheritance and composition to where you don't have the double maintenance of all the properties that you have to continuously maintain?
Mm-hmm. So I think what you're getting at is I've got the same property names in my domain model as in my view model in a lot of cases, right? Yep. So there's a couple of ways you could approach that. One is you could just bind your views directly to your domain model if you wanted to. There's nothing that forces you to have a separate view model. The reason I like having the view model separate from my domain model is I like to keep these data annotation attributes that say things like this is what the label should look like. Some of the validation and stuff like that. I like to keep that separate from my domain. Also, your view model has to have public setters, public getters, things like that. If I'm actually doing domain-driven design, I will not have hardly any public setters on my properties. I'll have I'll have methods on my domain type that are, actions that could change properties, but I'm not actually going to have public setters in most cases. So it kind of depends on the application. For real simple applications, not even necessarily really simple applications, but just you kind of got to make that determination yourself. Is it okay to bind directly to my domain models in this application? Sometimes the answer is yes. I've done that before on some applications as well. Typically, I like to have that view model layer in there because that kind of gives me the flexibility to change things up for the UI without affecting my domain. I like having that extra little bit of abstraction in there. But it is kind of a pain. I get where you're coming from. All right. So any other questions on that? All right. So... All right, so is there a question? Yeah.
Instead of decorating all the validation whether it be view model, is it a better option to go with a separate validation framework to which you can do your view model validation separately instead of undertaking all this attributes within the view model?
Yeah, so the answer is it depends, right? So that's always the answer in software development. Yeah, there are other ways that you can get that validation information from your application down to the view. One way is using the data annotations attributes, but you can implement your own model metadata providers. You can come up with your own conventions for how you specify what the validation is for different properties in your, either in your view model or your domain, depending on what you're mapping to. That's completely flexible and up to you. You've got to kind of decide what's appropriate for your application. In practice, I have never found myself needing to do something besides use data annotation attributes. So for me, at least, I've always just gone that route. All right. So that's we covered some of the core infrastructure. So you do need that. That's part of your application framework. But there's also more that should go in your application framework. Common functionality, things that you find yourself doing a lot of time, or a lot of different places in your application, that kind of stuff really should go into your application framework for a couple of reasons. One is consistency. A great example of common behavior that I've had in pretty much every application I've done is some way to display a little status message to the user. So, just a little message at the top of the page, maybe after a successful postback or something like that that says, record was saved, or maybe, to display an error message, hey, whatever request you just tried blew up. I've had to write that in pretty much every application I've ever done. That kind of thing should be part of your application framework because you want that to be consistent everywhere. You want to be able to take advantage of that without having to copy and paste the code around or think about, okay, what jQuery and HTML do I need to achieve this? You really want your application framework to provide that type of thing for you. So let's look at a demo. So, oops, that's not the one I meant to pull up. So we're going to use the JavaScript console here. And I'll show you where this is actually used in Fail Tracker in just a minute. I just want to kind of show you some of the stuff that's in here. Show status. So this is an example of functionality that's JavaScript specific, but I pushed it into my application framework. So it's available everywhere in my application. Every single view, every single JavaScript file in Fail Tracker can take advantage of this. And it's just, being able to show a status message. So in this case, we'll just have it say hello world, say it's a success type of message, and hello world shows up, and after about 5 seconds it fades out. So it's really simple, but it's one of those things where you'll probably find yourself repeating that pattern in other places. After a postback or something like that, or after an AJAX request, you want to show some kind of message to the user. Instead of having to think about how you solve that problem every time, push it to a layer in your application where you can just take advantage of it. And we can do the same thing for an error. So we can show hello world error. Yep. So another thing that I've added to Fail Tracker, and I've had to do this in a few other applications, is overriding the standard confirmation dialog. So let's look at this. So everybody's used the confirm function in JavaScript before, right? Gives you this ugly pop-up, says, are you sure? Yeah. Yep, I hate that too. Yep. So what I've done instead is I've pushed into my framework push into my framework something built on jQuery UI, this nice, prettier looking confirmation dialog. It's built, on conventions, and we'll look at how we can specify some defaults for some of that stuff. But now if I need to ask the user to confirm an action, I don't just have to use the built-in confirm function. I've got something in my framework that's just as easy to use. I can just call a different function, something that's baked into my application framework, and get a nicer user experience. So look for those kinds of things in your application as you're building out your MVC framework. If you start to see you're doing the same kinds of things across a couple of different views, consider rolling that into your framework, pushing that down a level in your application. That way you don't have to think about how you do it every time. Question?
Okay, so you develop all these great little pieces that you want to use in each of your apps. How do you get them from one app to the next? Do you keep like a blank template site almost that you use as your next one? Or?
So that's a great question. So you come up with some of these conventions and you want to start reusing them across applications. How do we achieve that? So that's actually the problem I'm trying to solve right now. The approach I'm taking, and I haven't rolled any of it out yet, is I'm starting to push a lot of this into NuGet packages. So I'm starting to push some of the JavaScript, some of the conventions and things like that, the automapper stuff, but push that into NuGet packages. That way I can just reference a NuGet package whenever I want to take advantage of some of these conventions I've already established. Another option is, I've done that before, just make a blank project template that has a lot of this stuff in there. The downside is that if you change something, you find an improvement in one application, you got to kind of port it around. NuGet should take care of most of that because I just edit it in my original package, upload a new package, update my applications, and boom, everything's got the latest and greatest. So, all right, so we've got some JavaScript stuff here built into our application framework. That's nice. What if I want to show that same kind of status message, but I want to trigger that from my controller? So that's another common thing. We really don't want to have to think about how we're going to achieve that every time. It'd be much better if we could just bake that into the framework. So we've actually got that in Fail Tracker. So let me log out and try to log in with a bad username.
Is Fail Tracker on Git?
Excuse me? Yes, it's on GitHub. So this status message behaves the exact same as if I triggered it from JavaScript. It's actually triggered server side, But it is a little bit nasty, the code, to do that. But once again, that's nasty code that's part of my application framework. And when I say nasty, I don't mean it's it's not that bad. But it's one of those things where if I have to think about it every time, if I have to think about how I want to make that status message show up, I'm going to be inconsistent. I'm going to screw it up. I'm going to copy and paste code around. It's much better if I can just say what I want. If I can just tell MVC, I want you to return a view, and I want you to show the status message. And then I let the framework take care of the rest. So how do we achieve that? Let's go to the account controller. So the logon form is checking to see is the user valid. If it's not, I'm going to return a view. I'm going to also pass back the same form. That way their email address gets filled in. But I'm also adding a little bit of extra behavior to it. So I've got an extension method, which is actually, anybody familiar with the decorator pattern, software design pattern? So for those that aren't, just a quick crash course on decorator. Decorator is basically, it's a class, it's a way to add functionality onto an existing class without actually having to use inheritance. So what this with error message extension method is doing is it's decorating whatever action result was about to be returned. In that case, I was about to return a view result. So it's actually going to decorate that view result with a status result. So a custom action result that I've written. All that action result, that custom action result really does is stuff a couple of properties into the ASP.NET MVC temp data collection. And like I said, this is what I would call kind of ugly code. I don't want to have to think about how to do this every single time I want to show a status message. I'd much rather have that abstracted away. So just
JavaScript looks for those things.
I have, exactly. Yep. So let's go to our main layout real quick. So our layout, we're including a partial view called status message. And if we look at status message, it's got an empty div that's hidden by default, and that's where our that status message that shows up at the top, that's where that thing is. But we have some JavaScript here, or we have some MVC to see, do we need to emit some JavaScript? So it looks to see, is there a status message in the temp data? If there is, I'm going to output this really small JavaScript block that will fire off my client-side helper to display that status message. So, and it's a little bit, It's not code that I would want to copy around and have to think about how to rewrite it every time, but since it's baked into my application framework, I just call an extension method when I return a view result, and it happens magically for me. My application framework takes care of everything else. So you guys want to see the JavaScript for that? Yes? Okay, so let's look at that. So by convention in fail tracker, I have a site object. This is my application framework client side. Probably should have called it app or something like that, but hindsight's 2020. Anyway, so the purpose of that site object is to provide a place to hook up all these custom helper methods and things like that. It's basically to expose my application framework client side. So my site object has this show status function, and it looks uglier than it is because there's a bug in the current version of jQuery UI around how the fade out and delay functions interact. But really, the meat of the JavaScript is right here. So we're finding that status message div, which was hidden. We're also figuring out what its parent HTML element is. In this case, it's that big div that wraps all the content. Then we're taking advantage of the position plugin that's new in jQuery UI 1.8. So I don't know if you've ever had to do like CSS positioning, absolute positioning before by hand. It's a real pain sometimes to get the exact look and feel you want. The position plugin takes care of all of that. All I had to do was say, center my status message, center its top at the center top of my parent element. So that little bit of position plugin logic right there takes my div, positions it absolutely right there in my my body div. So instead of me having to figure out some CSS for left and up top, all that, I just let jQuery do it. So any questions on that? This is the type of thing that I'm talking about pushing down into your application framework. It's not just the infrastructure, it's things that you want to be able to take advantage of everywhere, patterns that you see yourself repeating. Push those things down into the framework so that you can just take advantage of them. All right, so running kind of short on time, unfortunately, but all the code for this is on GitHub, and I actually got some blog posts that I'll put up to cover some more of this, but one thing that we'll talk about one more. If you guys need to leave, head to the next session, that's fine. I get to hang out as long as I want because I'm in here for the next session too, so I don't care if my session runs long. Planning for and handling AJAX errors. Okay, so this is another thing that I see, it's a common error that people make in MVC, and I guess it probably applies to other frameworks as well. If you're using jQuery to make AJAX requests, you have to think about what happens when that request goes wrong. Up until recently, a lot of the jQuery AJAX functions did not actually allow you to hook in an error handler. So if you called the post the post AJAX helper as opposed to the underlying AJAX helper, there was no overload that took in an error handler. You could pass in a function to execute when the request completes successfully, but if that request bombed out, you had no way to hook into it. That's been fixed in the most recent version of jQuery, but prior to that, you had to use the lower level .ajax function if you wanted to specify an error handler. Fortunately, there's another way that we can do that, and that's a good thing because I really don't want to have to think about how my AJAX errors need to be handled every single time I make an AJAX request. Because for the most part, I'm going to handle it the same way every time. There may be a few cases where I can do something different, if maybe I can recover from that error, but usually I'm going to show that little status message and tell the user something went wrong with your request, you probably should try reloading the page and see if that fixes it. I don't want to have to repeat that every single time I make an AJAX request. So let's see what I'm talking about here. So if we go to fail tracker, log back in. I've got some AJAX functionality here on the home page. I've got this delete button, so click that. Make sure it's going to delete. Yep. And nothing happened. Interesting. So let me try that again. Nothing happened. Wonder what's going on here. Well, if we look at the console, we can see the server actually returned a 404 for that AJAX request. As a user, though, I had no freaking clue what just happened. I clicked that button and nothing at all happened. So let's look at another example. So let's say I click this little preview button here, get this widget that pops up and it says loading, and nothing's happening. Go to my console and look, and yep, sure enough, that blew up, 404. So there's a problem with these AJAX requests, but since I didn't handle them, The user has no clue what's going on. They're just kind of left sitting there scratching their head. So it'd be much better if we could handle those things and display some kind of message to the user to let them know, hey, we got your request, just something went wrong in the processing. So how can we take advantage of that? So let's see. Let's go back to our site JavaScript file. So site.js is included everywhere through the master layout. jQuery, and yeah, I'm cheating, I have the code I need to write down here, but jQuery has a global error handler for AJAX requests. So I can hook into that. I can say AJAX error. When an AJAX error occurs, call this function. Event request functions. I really hate how Visual Studio, IntelliSense, and JavaScript work sometimes. Like indenting the content all around and drives me nuts. All right, so what we've done now is we've tied in an event handler that's going to get called every single time one of our AJAX requests anywhere in the application fails. And we're going to, let's grab some code from here. So let's say .ui, dialog, content. So what we're going to do is if say the AJAX request was associated to a dialog window being shown in jQuery UI dialog, we're just going to go ahead and close those if there are any. And now we're going to display a status message. So we're taking advantage of that show status function that we've already got in our framework for displaying, a message to the user. So if we go back to fail tracker, we reload everything. Now when we click this and something goes wrong, now the user knows what's happened. They get an error message. Same thing, I go to click this to preview, something happens, I get an error. I didn't give it time to fade out all the way. But so now if I'm working on an AJAX-y feature in my application, most of the time I don't have to worry about error handling. I can just I can just trust my application framework to do it all for me. There could be times where I need to specify or I want to specify custom error handling behavior, and I can do that. jQuery will let me kind of break in and specify my own event handler. But I can just let the application framework take care of it most of the time. So I'm not having to think about that anymore. So I was going to show you guys how to handle another common error, but we're not going to have time for it. An error that people often miss is what happens to your AJAX requests when their user is no longer authorized. So maybe they loaded up the page, they went to lunch, they came back, their session's timed out, they tried to make an AJAX request. That's a little bit trickier. I'll have a blog post up on that. I actually got one, but I'll put up another one with a more polished example. But you have to do a little bit of extra work to take advantage or to counteract what ASP.NET's doing for you. ASP.NET, the forms authentication module, is actually going to take your authorization denied, that 401 error, and it's going to swap it to a 302 error and send that AJAX request to your logon form. So now your AJAX method, or the AJAX function you just invoked, it's actually going to get back your login form as the response for that request. And it's going to look like a valid response. So unless you had some code to check and make sure that response was, JSON or whatever you were expecting, your code is technically going to, think the AJAX request completed successfully. So you have to do a little bit of work to counteract that. And I'll have a post up to show you how to do that. And so the problem with MVC is that it's not opinionated. They had to build that framework very generically so it could support lots of different databases so that you could build whatever you need to build for your business. They couldn't make a lot of assumptions, so there's really not a whole lot of there's not really much opinionated logic baked into the framework. Your application framework, though, what you build, that should be strongly opinionated. You know exactly what your business domain is. You know exactly what kinds of error handling requirements you have. You know exactly the types of common cross-cutting things that are going to keep showing up. You should have built into your framework opinions about how those should be solved. And for the most part, developers should be able to take care of those seamlessly. They shouldn't have to really do much to take advantage of those. If you're just going to pick up MVC and you're not going to worry about specifying conventions for how your views work, how you want to organize your JavaScript, all that, you should go back to WebForms. If you do not have conventions, you will make a giant mess with MVC. MVC gives you a ton of slack, and it's a great way to tie yourself in a knot. So if you're going to do MVC, think about conventions the entire time you're building things out. Start looking for repetitive patterns. trying to look to where you can push those into the application. Think about how you want people to handle things like, where does JavaScript and CSS go? You know, establish conventions for those things, because if you don't, you'll end up with that big pile of blocks that we saw at the beginning. So just to recap, a good application framework, it should free your developers, it should free you from having to think about uninteresting concerns in your day-to-day activities. It should use conventions, it should enforce conventions, but it should provide some way to kind of opt out of those, to progressively opt out of those things, so you can still take advantage of some of the convention, but alter its behavior. You don't want to spend a lot of time up front building an application framework. It's one of those things that should evolve with your application. There's a few things you should bake in at the beginning, like you should specify conventions for where JavaScript and things like that go. Most of it, though, you're going to evolve over time as you flesh out your application. The point of the framework is to help developers work the way they want to work. It should not be something where they're running into a brick wall constantly. You don't want them fighting against the framework. The framework's purpose is to enable them to write code and implement features in your application. And like we talked about, bake in conventions that make sense. Don't bake in something that if a new developer saw it, he's going to be totally baffled by the behavior of the convention. So that's it. So pretty close to on time, I think, sort of, yeah. All right, so if you want to know more, feel free to ping me on Twitter. Please ping me on Twitter anyway, or email or whatever. Let me know what you thought of the session. You can check out my site at trycatchfail.com. So I'll have some blog posts on there about MVC stuff related to this session in the coming days. Question?
Yeah, do you have any design guidelines on how many actions you have in control? So there are random like code.
Yeah, so the question is, are there any kinds of rules or guidelines for how many action methods you put on a controller? That's one of those things where it's kind of an intuition thing. There's a certain point where I start to feel like, man, this controller has gotten too big. I start looking at, okay, is there some other way I can break up these actions? Is there some other way I can organize them? MVC gives you a lot of tools for organizing your controllers and things. There's areas and things that going back to MVC2. So it's kind of one of those things that's application specific. You kind of have to decide what your threshold is for too much logic in a controller, and decide how you want to organize things. I typically try to keep my controllers focused around either an activity or a domain type. I think if you focus around the activity, that kind of tends to lead you towards smaller controllers than if you have just a monolithic controller that deals with everything related to a domain type. So I think kind of going towards a controller per activity it'll give you a larger number of controllers, but they'll fewer actions in each one. All right, so thank you guys. Sorry I kept you late. Thank you. So save me some food.